Order. Welcome to today's hearings of the Economic Security Subcommittee, and our focus today is on the nation's cybersecurity. We're extremely grateful to representatives from two of the country's most loved brands coming to talk to us about some outrageous attacks that they have suffered. Archie and Norman, thank you very much indeed for coming in today and for bringing your team, Victoria and Nick, along with you today. The attack that Marks and Spencer have suffered was appalling. Just on a human level, it must have been extremely distressing for everyone who worked at the company.
Yes, I've been in and around the leadership of large British public companies for longer than I care to contemplate, with a brief interlude in this place, not a very successful one, perhaps. I don't think there's anything quite like this, possibly a hostile takeover bid, because in the business world, we're used to competing, we're used to dealing with competition, customers, products that work, don't work, etc. But it's very rare to have a criminal actor in another country, or in this country, we're never quite sure, seeking to stop customers shopping at M&S. Now, they're essentially trying to destroy your business for purposes which are not entirely clear, but partly undoubtedly ransom, extortion. So it's like an out-of-body experience, and I think it's fair to say that everybody at M&S experienced it, like in the shops, our ordinary shop colleagues, working in ways they hadn't worked for 30 years, working extra hours just to try and keep the show on the road. I mean, let aside our tech colleagues, for a week, probably the cyber team had no sleep, or 3 hours a night. So it was, it's not an overstatement to describe it as traumatic. And it has endured some weeks, so we're still in the rebuild mode, and we will be for some time to come. So yes, it's like an out-of-body experience. It's completely extraordinary. And one thing I wanted to say is we're very grateful for the time here. I'm conscious we've only got a limited amount of time, but I wanted to say that we would like to use our experience to the benefit of, obviously, government, but other businesses that may experience similar events. So there's an open offer to you and members of the committee to be available.
We're extremely grateful for that, and we're conscious that there's a live investigation that is still underway. And we do not want to interfere in that in any way. So we would just like to ask you a couple of questions about what happened, and please be circumspect where you need to be circumspect before we move on to the wider implications and lessons that Parliament should draw for the future, and indeed for our recommendations about the nation's economic security in the future. Now, you described the attack as highly sophisticated and targeted. Are you able to tell us who you think the attackers were and how they got in?
Yes, I can give you the broad outline of that. I mean, firstly, of course, when this happens, you don't know who the attacker is. And in fact, they never send you a letter signed Scattered Spider. That doesn't happen. In fact, we didn't even hear from the threat actor for approximately a week after it penetrated our systems. So when this is going on, you rely completely upon your security advisors to say what they think is happening. And they recognize the threat actor by the attack vector, in other words, the pattern they use. But remember, too, the attacker's working through intermediaries, too. So we believe in this case there was the instigator of the attack, and then believed to be Dragon Force, who are a ransomware operation based, we believe, in Asia. So you've got loosely aligned parties working together. Does it matter who it is? Probably not. It probably doesn't change what you do. It affects the psychology that you have this unknown party believed to have a peculiar name the other side of the world. And the other thing just to be aware of is the threat actor typically makes themselves known, not just to us directly, and that, as I said, didn't happen for some time, and their contact. We took an early decision that nobody at M&S would deal with the threat actor directly. We felt the right thing was to leave this to the professionals. who have experience in the matter. But also they communicate through the media. And in this case, peculiarly, their chosen avenue of communication was principally the BBC, but not exclusively. So they were in contact with the BBC, and the BBC, I'm sure, handled it completely properly, and I would imagine were in touch with law enforcement before they went on air. But it was sometimes an unusual experience to be brushing your teeth in the morning when somebody comes from the BBC with a communication from the people who are allegedly attacking our business.
Was there a ransomware demand?
I think in almost, I guess it's almost 100% of cases. Part of the motivation for this is ransomware. I mean, I think that's well known. And part is also, I don't know, because we don't know who they are or how they were, but part is these are people who quite probably enjoy what they do. It's believed that this group were former computer gamers who graduated into cyber. That may not be true. I'm relying entirely on hearsay. So it's normal that they manifest themselves sooner or later in some sort of ransomware demand. As I said earlier, we're not in a position to discuss the nature of the interaction with the threat actor. And as I said, we separated our own people from that. The first time we heard from them directly was after about a week. One of the ironies of the problem on the business side of this is just a contextual, is that by the time the threat actor makes themselves evident, your systems are already compromised. And one of our big pieces of learning is once you've experienced an attack which has had any success at all, you are then in a multi-week process of systems rebuild. And whatever you do, you are going to have to rebuild, and it's going to take a long time to come back. And that's been our experience.
Did you have to pay the ransomware demand?
No, I don't think. I think that's a business and a decision. It's a business decision and it's a principal decision. The question you have to ask, and I think all businesses should ask, is when they look at the demand, what are they getting for it? Because once your systems are compromised and you're going to have to rebuild anyway, maybe they've exfiltrated data that you don't want to publish. Maybe there's something there. But in our case, substantially the damage has been done.
You'd obviously invested significantly in cyber defenses in front of this attack. You'd run scenario planning workshops, I think, to try and safeguard the business. I mean, looking back on the preparations that you did have in place, was there anything obvious in retrospect that you could have done differently?
In all humility, anybody who's suffered an event like ours, it would be foolish to say there's not 1,000 things you would like to have done differently. Because this has been very costly for our business and disruptive for our customers and so on. So of course, and we will have as you would expect us to, we'll have an in-depth review, which will be third-party facilitated to make sure we have all the learning from this, and we'll be very happy to share that. Just to be clear, because there have been media reports that, did M&S leave the back door open? Well, we didn't. That's all Horlicks. We had, firstly, there's a contextual point. Businesses like ours have a vulnerability, which is firstly that we have a very wide, what they call attack surface. It's all this new language you learn when you get the attack surface or perimeter. So we have 50,000 people, colleagues in the stores, contractors working for us, some may be outsourced, maybe in India, who are working on our systems. So the attack surface is enormous, and the attacker only has to potentially be lucky once with one of those 50,000. So the right thing to do if you're in our business is to assume that the perimeter is permeable. Ultimately, can they get in? They probably can if they try hard enough. And you have all the preventions that you should have, double two-factor authentication, password control, everything like that. But there's 50,000 points of entry. So you have to assume that they can get in. And in our case, the initial entry, which was on April the 17th, occurred through what people now call social engineering. As far as I can tell, that's a euphemism for impersonation. But it was a sophisticated impersonation. They didn't just rock up and say, would you change my password? They appear as somebody with their details. So, and part of the point of entry in our case also involved a third party. So it's just a reminder that attack surface is very hard to defend. The second point I'd make in terms of vulnerability is we've been around since 1884. So we do have legacy systems. Now, we probably wish we didn't. And one of the lessons is if you modernize your systems in a cyber secure way, you're going to be, but all businesses like ours have a hybrid of old and new. And that hybrid of old and new makes it harder to compartmentalize your system. So the question is, if they get in, how easy it is to move laterally? And that's inhibited by the interconnectedness of all our systems. And part of the reason why the attack has been business impairing for us is because we closed down the systems as part of a defense. So there was some impact, but when closed down the systems as part of the defense, which is the right thing to do. And I think you'll find that Co-op did the same and probably more radically than we did. And once you close them down, bringing them back up in safe form is very difficult.
And just in terms of lessons learned, which I think was where the question started, one of the things that we would say to others is make sure you can run your business on pen and paper, because that's what you need to be able to do for a period of time whilst all of your systems are down, you having taken them down yourself for protection.
That's right. Yeah. If you think, I talked to chief executive of one of the banks, and you may have done the same. And if you're running people's payment systems, you're responsible for their wages. It is true you cannot afford to fail. So they would have backup on backup. So they'd have huge redundancy in their systems. It's very energy intensive. They probably have 3 times the cloud capacity they need. Very expensive thing to do. As a retailer, you can't really afford to do that. So your resilience, as Nick has said, is what do you do when your time and attendance system isn't working? Well, I'm old enough to remember a time when they didn't work and you did have clipboards, but you need to be ready to go back to that time. And you improvise your way through.
It's very useful. Thank you. Sonia Kumar.
Chair, it's about £300 million that you've lost in this cyber attack. How's that affected your future plans, and how have you changed your model? Has it changed any of your mergers, acquisitions, or has it changed any of your future plans now?
That's a very good question. I mean, look, the £300 million, which is the estimate we produce. Firstly, that is a gross estimate of loss of profit. In other words, we make £300 million less profit before recoveries. Now, recoveries might, and we would expect they will, include insurance. There might be other things that we are able to save money on during the downtime. So it's to give the financial market some sort of guidance. And a lot depends on how rapidly we recover from here. Has it affected our future? Not really. I mean, you remember the context of M&S is when I joined the business, it was a fairly broken business. Our share price was tracking down. We made under half the profits we make today. We had £2 billion of debt. Our systems were in a pretty decrepit state. So I have to say, if this had happened then, I think we'd been kippered. But now we came into this year with £870 million profit, £425 million on the balance sheet. So we were muscled up, which is, that's, by the way, that's luck. That's, well, it's a lot of hard work, but it's fortunate it happened at this time. So we strongly believe that we need to come out of this stronger. So coming out of it stronger means we need to learn from the crisis. That means learns in terms of resilience, but also learn in terms of some of the things you do learn, like in the pandemic, you can do quicker and better with less bureaucracy. So we learn from that. We will bring forward some of the rebuilding of our systems because it makes sense to do so. And we're going to have to rebuild some, like our aging version of SAP, which is the core financial system. We'll bring that forward. So the result will be our capital spending will come forward. Will it change our strategy? No. In fact, it just means we're going to put the foot down harder. No, we've been gaining market share for the last 5 years. We've been the fastest growing food business on like-for-like sales for the last 4 years. We're going to go harder. And we think we owe it, we owe it to ourselves and to our customers to say we can stride on.
This rebuild time, how long do you think that's going to be? What's the time frame of this rebuild time that you have, do you envision?
Well, that's one of the frustrating things is, firstly, we all think that if your systems go down, what you do, you go and change the fuse and turn the lights back on. It doesn't work like that. There's several reasons for that. So the straight answer to your question is it will be months. So we'll still be in a form doing things, rebuilding in months to come, but the customer will not see anything different from the end of this month. Well, we hope it's the end of this month, maybe before that. And just remember, we've traded all our stores fully throughout the crisis. The reason the 300 million is particularly impactful for us is because a third of our clothing and home business is sold online, and the online business is disabled. So roughly speaking, for each week we weren't trading online, we were losing £10 million in profit, roughly speaking. Now we are now up and running online, but we're not back to where we should be. And our big automated centre in Castle Donington comes back online, well, hopefully imminently. So it's a long, slow process back. And then some of the background systems that hopefully you won't see or customers don't see, we will be working on in October, November to bring back, or either to bring back or replace. See, one of a couple of points I'd make here. One of the things that once you've had one cyber attack, you're more likely to have another. Partly, I suppose, just because you attract attention to this community and people can see what happened. So we want to make ourselves as resilient as possible, for the future. And that means the way in which you bring things back has to be highly protected. So our early return was completely resilient. We had no remote working. So anybody working on systems had to be within a data center, which was fully protected by, we had it's called Juniper protection system. We call it rings of steel. So you want early on, you want to come back in a very, very secure way. That takes longer than if you had multiple outsourced people working on your systems from around the world.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good point. Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to ask 4 quick questions, hopefully with 4 quick answers. I'm going to ask the same to the Co-op because I'm keen to try and get an understanding of the differences and similarities of what happened to you in your response to that. So you say April 17th was the date that they got in. You found out that later. What then was the date you knew that they were in?
April 19th.
April 19th.
Well,
and then what was the date then you then went public with that? And
speaking of, we know, and we have complete details, which obviously shared with the NCA of the point of entry and the manner of entry, and we've tracked their path through. Became evident to us on the late afternoon of the Easter Saturday, April 19th, that they were in the system. And we called the first crisis management team meeting that evening at 10 o'clock.
Yeah. And then what the next date was when you shut down your site and let your customers know there was a problem?
We alerted all the relevant authorities the following day or when they were back to work after Easter. So that included the NCA, the NCSC, the FCA, the ICO, and the Irish authorities. So there's a whole string of people.
And went public?
We went public on the Tuesday. Yes, I think I got that right.
Yeah. 22nd.
So what you raise the point is that when you're dealing with all this, one of the issues is there's a media maelstrom.
Yeah.
The media are we're the most public of public companies. So I'm not We're used to it. It's what we expect. We have 40 million customers to look after and 50,000 colleagues. So we expect that. But you have to deal with a lot of media at a time when you can't necessarily answer all the questions.
And then when you realised your site was under attack, but before you went public, did you let other retailers know that was happening? And if so, what was the process for that?
The process for that is through the NCSC. So that is their role. And I've spoken to them. My reason to believe that is exactly what they did. So you must ask the co-op, but I think that they would have been, I hope they would have been alerted by the NCSC. And we shared all the information about the vector and manner of our attack so that then they could alert the other retailers. And they do operate a sector group so that they can coordinate.
Great. I mean, you covered some of this with the chair's question, but it sounds like your systems weren't particularly well segregated given the legacy systems you had in place, so that to allow them to move through your system. Would that be fair to say?
I think just one point I would make is that we chose to take the systems down, and actually even at the height of the attack, over 50% were unaffected and protected. So the chairman's absolutely right, and what he's saying is that when you have a business like retail, if you think about the complexity and even going to the shop and picking whatever you want at any time you want, lots of systems have to talk to each other. We have 1,000 sites effectively, each store's a different site. But actually, there's a difference between choosing to take systems down and them being taken down. And I think we chose to do the former, not the latter.
Ideally, you'd have all your systems, but it's not possible in retailers to be completely watertight compartments. And then the question arises, but is technical, around the software that sits between the systems and allows access. And that's different for every retailer. But, when you look back on this, architecture, the foundation architecture is very important to resilience, but there's never a point in time, unless you have a completely new business, where you design it that way, so you inherit it. I would make the other point just, again, because I don't want people to get the wrong impression. We were very well aware of the risk. If you look at our annual report, but you look at actually any large company annual report, you'll find cyber risk is listed in the top of their risks. It was had the full attention of the Audit and Risk Committee. We have trebled the number of people working on cybersecurity to 80 in our business over the last 2-3 years. We have doubled the amount of expenditure. Thanks to my colleague on my left, we curiously doubled our insurance cover last year.
Okay.
I don't know how that was prescient.
Right, just quickly, my final question. This follows up from the question the chair asked, and I just wasn't 100% sure what the answer you gave was. Yesterday in the House of Commons, the Right Honourable Member for Goole and Pocklington warned about cyber attacks and ransomware attacks, and he said, and I quote, "It's come to my attention that one such company has paid a very large sum to its blackmailer recently. Can I ask you, has any been your organisation or have you paid that ransom?"
Sorry.
I'm asking, did you pay the ransom?
We've said that we are not discussing any of the details of our interaction with the threat actor, including that subject, but that subject is fully shared with the NCA and the relevant authorities. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that we don't think it's in the public interest to go into that subject, partly because it is a matter of law enforcement. And just to be quite clear, we think it's a matter of live law enforcement, and we want to give people the best possible chance of pursuing that action. Secondly, part of what the threat actor is looking for is publicity. So we can't avoid them getting publicity because they're communicating directly through the BBC, etc. But we want to make sure that we limit the amount of oxygen they have.
Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Well, perfectly segueing into my question, which was, I'm just interested in your experience of the insurance cover that you had, whether or not it was enough, what the interaction was like with your insurer, and perhaps any of the things, the sort of like what if moments and what other businesses might be able to learn from that, because this is going to be the threat that all businesses need to have at the top of their risk register. And perhaps there's some questions we need to understand about the state of the insurance industry. So are you able to give us a bit of information about your experience of that?
Well, my colleague here is better able to comment than I, but we have extensive insurance cover. I mean, some of that's been reported, although we haven't publicly disclosed the details. We fully expect to make a, unsurprisingly, significant claim, and we fully expect to receive some substantial recovery, but we don't know how much that process is likely to take, 18 months or...
Well, I was smiling as we started to answer the question, because I think I was probably about to turn myself into an advert for the insurance industry, because I think it's very important that PLC knows that these policies are available and takes them out. As far as our interaction is concerned with our insurers, you'd expect right from day one, it's been a very engaged conversation, because I think we've all got experience of making claims on policies in our own life. That's something that you do very much hand in glove with your insurer. So we're in a almost daily dialogue with them. They're being very supportive, and as Archie says, I think I've got some work for a period of time keeping that an active conversation.
Were there any sort of terms when you took out the policy that suggested that if a particular type of cyber attack was to occur, that you wouldn't have been covered?
Well, I think the thing that we did do in terms of structuring the policy is a year previously, we took a look at how that market was pricing, and we realized that we were insuring for the trivia and not for the catastrophic. And so we flipped the way that we were insuring, and we effectively said, well, we'll take the first amount of exposure ourselves, and then we will insure for the worst case scenario. And it just turns out, and thanks to colleagues who made that recommendation, it turns out to have been a decent decision.
Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. What support did you receive from the governments, from law enforcement, from government agencies?
So we've had quite a high level of interaction from the beginning, from the time we first reported. I think it probably is fair to say it was a little slow at the beginning. I mean, in law enforcement, we initially referred to West Yorkshire Police, which I think was the lead agency, and then we arrived at the Met, and then we arrived at the NCA.
How long did that take, Archie? How long did that triaging process take?
I think it was over several days. It turned into perhaps weeks, but the thing to emphasize is that I think that's because the situation was evolving. So it
sounds like it was quite a frustrating process.
No, I wouldn't want to convey that at all. It was just a question of being in the right channel and making, because initially you're telling people you don't know the full extent of what's happened.
I think probably my guess is that you would have to ask them, that it's a question of scale. So once it became clear that the level of the attack and the fact it was affecting other people in the industry, that it was, my guess, it would escalate it to the NCA. We also, by the way, had an interchange with the FBI, who are very supportive. I think it's understandable that the FBI are more muscled up in this zone. 60% of all cyber attacks reportedly happen in America anyway, but also they would be. And our advisors, our security advisors, were very good at helping us with those contacts. I think what I would comment on, because to address the question, is that we have no complaint about our interaction. I would say the interaction is tends to be a little bit one way, but that's not a criticism. In other words, we are informing them of what transpired so that they can then do their deliberations or investigations. It's then the NCSC's responsibility to make sure that the information is appropriately networked. I would say, as a comment, and I've talked to them about this, I think they would agree, the level of NCSC interchange tends to be probably a little bit more at CISO level, cybersecurity officer level. In my view, it would help to have a little bit more of a boardroom presence. When something like this happens, it is the chief executive level of issue. And that level of interchange needs to take place. That's not a criticism, it's just saying that's their current way of operating. In some countries, but this is not something we're not complaining we didn't have it, But in some countries, you would have more of a single port of call. So they would say, look, right, here's your account officer, for want of a better word. And by the way, they would say, if you want us to ride in the cab with you, we will. So do you like us to come to a crisis management meeting, give your advice, listen to what's happening so we gain the intelligence? That's not our current mode. And my guess is that we're just not resourced up to operate at that level.
So on that topic then, is that the kind, if you, obviously we're no doubt going to be wanting to go back to government and say, and the government going to want to learn from this as well, is that the kind of thing that you think government should be implementing in the future, that two-way dialogue, that join you and be with you for the process?
Yes, I do think that, and I think that would find favour with the relevant agencies too. I think they would acknowledge that would be useful. Obviously they are, but you'll understand that they're limited in their resources. I just think that, well, if you raise it up, I mean, I think that if you want a growth economy, you need a cyber resilient economy. So people can say, I invest in the UK, I'm more likely to be protected against this sort of event because they've very high standards of cyber, very high quality advisors and good national authorities. I think that should be our aspiration. It is indeed referenced in the industrial strategy, and I think rightly so.
Actually making our country the safest place to do business is a competitive advantage in this world.
100%. And I think that is a function of having very good authorities, very fluent interchange with the enterprise community. Because remember, the intelligence at the front line is typically in the businesses, not in GCHQ or wherever, although they're obviously very well informed. I think you have to recognize it's global. So these threat actors are not typically based in Surrey. They might be in Malaysia, they might be in Russia, in this case rumored to be in the US and UK, but we don't know. So you have to have an authority that's capable of networking at a global level and making a punch at that level. And the other point I'd make is that it's very advantageous if we in this country have leading cybersecurity experts because we have a cyber services industry. We do have some good companies who work in this space, but like, as you'd expect, the really big operations that come out of the US.
Thank you, Chair. You've obviously had to become cyber experts in the last few months, and I heard a lot of focus on activity since then, since the event. But you took 2 to 3 years. You said over the last 2 to 3 years as a board, you have been executing change. I would argue that reputational risk, operational shutdown, supply chain chaos, and the financial devastation that you have encountered have been well publicised by the cybersecurity industry, particularly since COVID and the change in the attack surface that brought on. You brought in a global CISO in 2023, a new chief architect only weeks before the attack occurred. What specific actions were you taking since 2020, not in the last couple of years, to actually make the changes to that legacy architecture and to protect yourselves much earlier against the very risks that you've now come up against?
Yeah, no, Alison, I understand the question, and that's the question we obviously ask ourselves too. Just remember, broader context is this is a business that in multiple dimensions was in, put it politely, recovery mode and rebuild mode. So, and we had limited financial capacity. From around the time you refer to 2020, we've been in much better financial position. We certainly are now, so we can accelerate the change. That's not an excuse. When we look back on this, in all humility, will we find things we say, well, we wish we'd done that? Yes, of course we will. We did we brought on board a new team, as you referred to, including a new CTO 2 years ago, 18 months ago, a new CISO prior to that. As I mentioned earlier, we muscled up the defense team. The defense team, the cybersecurity team is there to defend, but what they have to defend is the thrust of your question. And I think we would say, with the benefit of hindsight, would we like to have brought forward our capital spend on technology to strengthen the architecture? Yes, we would. Remember, we started 7 years ago with a business that was 80% in on-the-ground servers. So we've in computer centers, we had something called, people don't talk about now, but it's called a mainframe. You might remember mainframe.
Indeed.
We had a mainframe, it was IBM, we had to migrate off. So there was quite a lot of foundation work that had to be done before we could even worry about some of the things we really wanted to worry about. We made good progress on all of that. But also with that, we've been investing heavily in new data systems to ensure we've got customer data properly marshaled and harbored. With the move to online is a very big change. We have a loyalty card system, but all these things absorb capital. That's not an excuse. It's just saying, have we been investing? Yes, we would accelerate the investment. I think lessons for us or other people, there's some basic things that people sometimes forget. So in a legacy system, you have very distributed systems. There are multiple different places. They were installed by probably contractors you no longer use. I would say mapping your systems sounds really basic, but having an absolutely rigorous map of exactly how they all interface, what is hosted in each server, who has access to it. It sounds really elementary, and it's not, the fancy stuff, but I would say that is one of the things that I would advise everybody to do.
Thank you. And can I just go back to a slightly separate topic, the role of the board? So in my view, the role of the board should be to provide the governance of the executive team. But do you feel in that period since 2020 that you were, as a board and as chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, putting sufficient focus on cyber risk? And would you make recommendations about board governance going forwards?
Look, I just think that any business that suffered a cyber attack to turn around and said we put sufficient emphasis on cyber risk would be a hard claim to make. I mean, do we wish we'd spent more, done more? Of course we do. Would it have prevented the attack? Not necessarily, but that's not a reason for not doing it. I don't want to sit here and say, no, we did everything possible, because I don't believe that's the case. I don't think that's the case for any business. Did we accelerate the level of intensity of attention, the focus on it, the resources allocated to it? Absolutely. And our chief executive, Stuart, said to our CISO, Steve Cottrell, 18 months ago, if you need any resources, just let me know. Now, that's the, if you like, the CISO team is the elastoplast, isn't it? It's the first line of defense, but it's not the critical issue.
I'm keen to move on to wider implications. I'm keen to move on to wider implications.
Could you share some broader lessons for businesses to build cyber resilience in future? And is there a role for government in that?
Yes, and your point on governance, I think there is a lot of focus on this. I think that what I would say is that we had simulations last year, and the board was, or the risk committee was very fully briefed on all that sort of thing, but nothing survives the first whiff of gunshot. I mean, the simulation and the red team attacks were as nothing to what happens and the intensity of it. And I do think that, I don't think you can regulate your way to security in this space. I think there are things that government can do and regulatory things that government can do, but I don't think we should see that as the solution. I do think the point you're driving at, which is to make sure boards are very fully aware and intelligent about and educated about what happens, and they experience when it does happen, because it is punitive, and as we've seen. And I'm very happy, and I've already got one or two boards have invited me to come and see them to share our war stories, which I will certainly do. But I think the government can play a bigger role in making sure that's socialised. My view is the level of interchange is much better, as I said, at CISO and within the cyber community than it is at board level. But it's not true that boards are not interested. They're a bit like us. They're saying we're doing everything we can, but probably there is more they could do.
Alison, just to your point on government support, or the chairman spoke, my chairman, not your chairman, spoke about it very well, but I think there's so much activity going on in different government departments. So you have science innovation and leading a large part of this. You've got Cabinet Office leading another section of it. You've got Home Office consulting at the minute, or it's closed. And you've obviously got industrial strategy and business and trade. And I think being able to bring that together in something that's more cohesive, you know, the UK, I think, is number 3 behind the US and China in terms of our capability and investment in cyber and seeing it as an asset to the economy. So it's a really strong position for us to leapfrog, bringing the kind of opportunity of it together as well as managing the risk. So you help UK PLC be more resilient, but also try and grow it as a sector, thinking about that more holistically, and therefore having a single owner across government, I think would be incredibly helpful.
Okay, I mean, because time's marching on, but to your question, another probably oblique point. We do think that mandatory reporting is a very interesting idea. It's apparent to us that quite a large number of serious cyber attacks never get reported to the NCSC. In fact, we have reason to believe there have been 2 major cyber attacks of large British companies in the last 4 months, which have gone unreported. Now, I'm not on the board of those companies, so I don't know, but that's what we have been advised. And we think that's a big deficit in our knowledge as to what's happening. So I don't think it would be regulatory overkill to say if you have a material attack, define material, for companies of a certain size, you are required within a time limit to report those to the NCSC, and that would enhance the intelligence, the central intelligence body around this. So that it's not that there's nothing government could do, that's for sure.
Any further reflections on things that the government needs to do?
I think it's a bit like Alison's point to us is you know, in 2023, there was a security committee report which highlighted that this was critical to national resilience and advocated proper resourcing and expenditure. And I'm not aware that we've seen a substantial increase in government investment since that time. You wouldn't want to be here after a catastrophic event in 3 years' time with Alison saying to you, well, what was your board discussing? So it's an easy thing to say, but I do think that the NCA particularly probably is under-resourced for the task it's trying to undertake, but don't want to speak for them, and I don't even know what resources they have.
The concern that we have is that you've got substantial private ownership of what is in essence public risk. And if you had a number of retailers taken down all at the same time, and that had been coupled with some kind of public scare campaign on social media, for example, about shortages opening up, you could easily foresee a situation when there would have been widespread panic. This was the scenario that Lord Sedwell put to us. So I'm interested in whether you think that there are good spaces or good institutions in our country where the private sector and the public sector can war game the kind of risks that we now confront as a country in order to think through the kind of economic security precautions that are going to be needed in this new age.
Well, I don't think that happens now. I'm not aware if it does.
You think it should?
Yes, but I think it has to happen at board level.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a technical problem. I think it has to happen really chief executive or chairman to chairman. And the government's got, I always think in this country, the government's slightly coy about the way it engages with the enterprise sector, but the government has great convening power. If we're all invited to rock up to talk about cyber security and national resilience, we will do. And we'll want to support, and companies like us that have been through the process can add some value. So I do think that's the case. And I would make the point, which I know everybody's well aware of, that at the moment, the majority of cyber attacks are extortion related, and they relate to the enterprise sector, not exclusively. We've seen them, the British Library and others. But were this to be a hostile foreign actor seeking to do damage to the state, I think we'd see very different outcomes, because it's not for me to speak for the state of national infrastructure or outsourced national infrastructure, but we know some of it would be highly vulnerable.
Indeed. Finally, Matt Weston.
Thank you, Chair, and good to see you again. Just really picking up on the point about your legacy systems. And I think there's a learning there maybe for all of us, not just in the private sector, but in the public sector too. You mentioned about the British Library. Compared to the £300 million, which you're saying is a gross kind of estimation of hit to profit, would you be able to tell us confidentially, probably not now, when it comes to your legacy systems that you were saying, Archie, about the upgrades that you were looking to do, the financial situation meant you couldn't do it, what kind of budget cost you need to spend on upgrading those legacy systems that you would have been spending last year, this year, the following year, just to give some context versus the 300 million? Because therein, I think, we need to understand, what does UK PLC need to do against the kind of potential hit we might be facing?
There may even be a case, you see, for tax subsidies for that kind of thing. If we judge it to be something that is really important to our economic security going forward, then there is an argument that actually there's a public good, if you like.
It could be some fiscal kind of incentive for businesses to really focus on this.
Could be an idea there. To answer your question, Matt, I mean, probably the finance director is going to kill me, but the roughly dimensionally, we're spending about 600 to 650 million pounds a year on capital. That's rising every year, but then we're more profitable every year, so we can afford it. And we've got the balance sheet. Of that, we expect in excess of 200 million, close to 250 million, to go on technology-related expenditure. Of that, probably half, or might be 150 million at the moment, would be due to legacy. I say legacy upgrades. Don't think there's no business benefit to that. There is. I mean, with modern systems, when it comes to modern supply chain systems or merchandise assembly systems in clothing and home, what we'll install will both be more resilient and more effective for the business than what we had before. There's some things that are difficult. I mean, SAP is a sort of foundation architecture system, as you'll understand, and propels all our financial controls. Upgrading to a modern version of SAP does have some benefits, but substantially it's a nil return investment. It's just something we have to do.
So
you go on, sorry.
Looking back partly to Alison's question about investment, I think the chairman's being a bit coy about what he pushed the business to do earlier on. So if we cover from 2019-20 to 2024, it was just over 400 million of capex in technology, and obviously a large part of that was on modernisation. So it's massively significant in terms of the capex that the business has spent while you've been chair.
The only other thing I'd add is that it's not just a financial decision, because if you talk to our CTO, she'll say, we've got to keep the business operating. So you can't simply switch the business off, spend lots of money and then turn it back on. So one has to factor in that there's an ongoing need for the enterprise to run during the transition.
It is going back to the earlier point about, I mean, this isn't a solution, but one of the things that's happened is now most technology investment is written off for a very short period of time. And I remember you buy a system and depreciate over 7 or 8 years. So it didn't really impact the P&L. Now, broadly speaking, you're writing off over 3 years. And a much higher proportion of technology investment is effectively rented software stored in the cloud, and that's expensed in year. So the P&L, it eats your P&L as you spend the money. It's not wrong, by the way. It's just the way it is today.
Yeah.
So you don't get capital allowances for buying a new version of SAP.
Yeah. Well, time's against us. Archie Norman, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to reflect on the terrible experience that M&S has been through. Good luck in getting the business fully back on its feet. And thank you very much for sharing some of the implications for public policy with us this morning. That concludes this.
I should just say that I declare a non-financial interest in that my son actually works for the co-op, and so was to some extent on the front line of all this. But I wonder if you could just give us a picture of what happened and a sense of how you realised you had a problem and what the difficulties then were. And our understanding from the previous session is that you may have taken the decision yourselves, a bit like a doctor cutting off an injured limb to save the body. So a lot of the damage, I think, may in effect have been self-inflicted. If you could just talk us through your decision-making process on that, that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And firstly, thank you for inviting us here. And it's a good analogy. We've had a number of analogies used. I think it might be helpful in a moment for Rob just to take through some of what we saw the attackers do and how we responded. But just before we do that, I think this was a sophisticated cyber attack on Co-op Group in April. The criminals used a variety of methods to seek to access systems and data. Within hours, we had detected those, we had set up our continuity processes, and in doing so managed to prevent deployment of ransomware and any serious damage to either our systems or to our members. However, I think there's a reality check here that is that no organisation, regardless of how prepared you might be, is entirely invulnerable to these sorts of attacks, and they are going to get more sophisticated. For example, the actions that were taken to avoid that more significant disruption, however controlled and sort of proactive they may have been, did have a significant impact for a short period of time on some parts of our operations. We know that member information limited to names and addresses and contact details and dates of birth, but still that was copied by the attackers when they were in our systems for such a short period of time. And so, it's important that we say, for that, we are very sorry to our members, and we feel their concerns deeply. I think it's important that we recognise that this is something which is going to become more and more sophisticated, and the steps that we take and the proactive steps that Rob and his team have particularly taken, and then across all of our colleagues to whom we're massively thankful for how well they've pulled together, that is not going to be the only, the answer to making sure that we're entirely impervious to cyber attacks in the future. But if it's okay, it might be helpful for Rob just to take
Rob,
you through
tell
quickly.
us what happened. How did people get in, and what do we know about who they were?
I'll take a minute or two and just walk you through the kind of salient points. So the initial attack took place on the 25th of April. So in effect, we saw from our side a colleague account acting maliciously. Our cyber defences kicked in immediately and restricted the activities of that account.
Rob, can I just check, at this stage, were you aware that there had been an attack on Marks and Spencer's?
We weren't. We actually spoke to them after we contained the threat. So the following week, we very helpfully via the NCSC road exchanged notes. But yeah, by that point, we were unawares of the activities. We had reached out, but clearly they were having very busy time.
There was media speculation, so we knew that they'd been disrupted.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
I'll just continue. Yeah. So effectively, we saw the malicious behaviour, which within minutes, when the systems block those activities, they notify our teams they were logged in. And then I guess for the next 24 hours, best summarised as a bit of a firefight, as we were locking accounts out and trying to restrict what they were able to do. At that point on the Sunday, we had effectively restricted things like VPN access, but also remote access into our systems as a way of ensuring that we're able to keep the criminals out of our systems. And in doing so, there was a minor impact to some of our colleagues because they couldn't work remotely at that point for certain systems. It's worth me also pointing out that our systems are heavily segregated, which means that this was very much focused on one specific zone. Throughout, all of our online business continued to operate as normally, and our retail stores and payments, etc., are segmented, so therefore they weren't part of this attack. But specifically after the attack had taken place, we then brought in our pre-agreed forensics teams, which we had on contract prior to these events occurring. We stood up our incident management response, and this is on the Sunday, having had the event occur on the Friday. And then by Monday, we were clearly going through the forensic analysis of precisely what had taken place. This, as Dominic says, is a sophisticated attack, and it's actually multi-stage. So what was then interesting is on the Thursday of that week, we saw effectively software within our network trying to communicate with a threat actor's website. So this is really where you start to try and download a payload, or the ransomware would effectively come and deploy. Again, our defenses spotted that those IP addresses were actually, or those addresses were of a threat nature, and therefore blocked all communication.
We then identified the source, or where the source of this kind of beaconing was coming from. And then we took the proactive measure to say, look, you can't guarantee when you're watching, say, 4,000 website contacts happening a minute that one of them may not be listed, for example. So we proactively paused all of the communication within that zone until we're able to identify the root cause of it. We then identified that the root had spread to a number of domain controllers, which is a technical term, but effectively it meant that we would hold the block in place while we rebuilt roughly 40 or so key system pieces of equipment. And then we were able to restore service about 14 days after, about a week we left the block on. And at that point, clearly we had mitigated the ransomware deployment, but we had also ensured that we'd done the containment exercise of our core network before we were able to then start, if you like, releasing our systems and services. Through that period, we were using business continuity plans for the 2 weeks on things like our food ordering to store. This was heavily oriented at our back office, so it's the sort of systems we use for putting orders out to suppliers, or some of our colleague-facing systems. As I say, our customer-facing services were still available throughout.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Cooper, anything further on that?
Yeah, thank you. You've given us a good overview there, and you've talked as well about how your systems coped. And obviously, you presumably, like most companies, you'd war game this sort of eventuality. What's your assessment of how well you had prepared? Did you think you could have? And hindsight's 20/20, of course, but do you think you could have done more? And what do you think about what more you could have done? And you talked there about the compartmentalization of your systems. I presume that was done deliberately with one eye on this kind of eventuality. Is that something you think actually was helpful?
Both excellent questions. On the first one, wargaming is something we absolutely do. I would say it takes two forms. One is, you'll hear me talk about things like our crisis management response. So we have a bronze, silver, gold approach. We had actually wargamed this precise scenario before as a leadership team. So the board itself was very well prepared for who would take what role, and that definitely paid dividends through the crisis. In regards to technical, we run what we call red team or purple team exercises. So these are simulated attacks where we pay third parties to act as the criminal gang, and we provide them without devices, and then we provide them with devices, and we take the learnings from that and make sure it feeds into our annual investment in cybersecurity. If you could remind me of the second part of your question, that'd be great.
How well do you think your systems coped then? Obviously, on a board level, you think it went quite well, the system itself, because it was designed in such a way to effectively firewall things. Was that quite helpful as well? And I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, you had red teamed this, but it still happened. Absolutely. So is the level of threat higher than you anticipated then?
I think the most important thing is that there is no one rule to cybersecurity defense. So for us, it's that layered components. So yes, you can't prevent everything, social engineering or what we call zero-day vulnerability, so gaps found in software that nobody knows about. You have to ensure that you can both detect, which is what you saw play out in the scenario that I discussed, but also that you can respond very effectively. So there are a number of pieces of equipment effectively at our disposal, but also ensuring that you've thought through what those business continuity plans will be to pick up in there. There are always lessons to be learned. I would say that no matter how many times you do a simulated exercise, even with that type of thing, the pressure in the moment on the individuals involved, and honestly, the teams, and on the record, I would say how appreciative I've been of my own teams and their ability to respond in what is an incredibly tough situation. They are, these are husbands and wives, these are mums and dads, and they are required to put in an awful lot of time, and it's a very high pressurized environment because their decisions count in the minute. So I would say that there are always learnings from a real experience versus those simulated ones, but the simulated ones are incredibly helpful.
I could just pick up on the social engineering part that you mentioned. That is that your understanding of how these people got in? Again, my limited knowledge of this social engineering is where there's effectively impersonation. So someone phones your IT people and said, "Can you change my password?" That person's not who they purport to be. Is that your situation?
Absolutely. They were able to impersonate a colleague. They were able to successfully answer a number of security questions to be able to get that account reset. That activity happened about an hour before they started to use the account maliciously. And at that point, clearly our teams were notified because of the types of activity they're trying to do are not prohibited in the network, and therefore they responded immediately to that.
Okay, Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk briefly about how the business has been impacted with day-to-day customers and members. But I'd also just like you to talk a little bit about how specifically with Co-op Group having different co-ops of societies across the country, obviously different independent companies, but supplied by yourselves as a group, how that communication process worked and how it impacted on those businesses too.
Yeah.
So I'll give a bit of an overview, and then if there's specific points on the technical side, then Rob can come in. Because of the nature of our business, but also because, as we've talked before about the segregation of our systems, the impact was quite different across different areas. And so if you look, for example, at our online business and our payment systems, which are which allow people to pay, those were unimpacted. All of our stores remained open. However, within our distribution centre, we were reverting back to those manual processes that were referred to in the previous section of committee business, which obviously has a significant impact on efficiency.
Are they already, those backup systems, those paper-based systems?
Well, they're there, but it's how often that you test them, and I think that that's a key piece. One thing that we learnt, though, through to your question before, Mr. Cooper, was the parts of our business continuity exercises, which I think paid off most in the sort of preparation stages, are actually the parts which dictate exactly how you are going to make decisions in that pressured moment. It's more the generic ways of working. You can, of course, look at specific events, but you never know which particular part of the system is going to be impacted and how it works. Now, within that, there's lots that we'll have learned which we'll be taking away around, okay, where are our key vulnerabilities when you do go back to those paper-based systems? Is it going to be in depots? Is it going to be? But again, it will impact, because had it been the payment system, we'd have had to find a different approach. So I think that just you need to be prepared around the specifics and really understand where your key sort of the key things are to keep your business running. But equally, I think it's you don't ever know quite how it's going to impact when these sorts of things hit in the way that they do. So how do you make sure that you can make those decisions, that you can take the actions that you can do quickly, I think is probably the most critical part.
Reynolds.
So shall I continue? So across our food business, that was impacted. Across our wholesale business, there was no impact. So we also delivered to a number of independent stores, including the Nicer brand, which is part of the Co-op group, and that equally wasn't impacted. However, some of our franchise stores, and importantly, as you referenced, the independent society members, so for any committee member who's not aware, there are a number of cooperative societies. We are the largest, but we also supply goods under buying group arrangements to the other societies. Because of the impacts in depots, whilst they weren't impacted directly by the cyber attack, obviously there was a knock-on impact. The other thing that we had to consider through that is that it impacts different localities and stores. We run a number of stores, what we call our lifeline stores, in areas where the impact of a store being shut is different. Some areas you can't just go to a different retailer around the corner. If you think about the Highlands, some of the island locations. So we had to then consider, how do we make sure that we get the right prioritization around those? Across our life services businesses, so our insurance business was unimpacted, and our funeral care business managed to continue to provide all the funerals in the way in which the loved ones wanted. However, a lot of the colleagues in our funeral care business were reverting to paper-based systems, which inevitably we're now having to update the systems now they're back online. Our legal services business, because of the nature of how their systems worked, our legal services colleagues all log on in through the methods that were locked down by the actions which Rob and his team took. So that was more heavily impacted than other parts of the organisation. And so we had to look to make sure that we were prioritising those more critical cases and that we stopped taking on new business so that we could focus on existing customers. So it was quite varied across, which is, I think, just reflects the segregated nature of the systems.
And then as a member-based structure for your organisation, obviously the kind of conversations and level of communication you have to have with your members is very different to that of M&S from panel one. Can you talk us a little bit how that member communication took place?
Of course. So we are a member-owned organisation, and whilst we have listed debt, which means that we do have some market obligations, we don't have listed shares, so we don't have quite the same consideration around some of the communication to investors. In fact, our owners are the same people who are shopping with us and the people who are impacted. So we always want to make sure that we are being as transparent as we possibly can with our owners. There's then the balance between making sure that you know enough to be able to, in these situations, there's always information gathering. So within certainly a few days of the attack happening, noting it happened on a Friday, we had communicated out to our members both by way of an announcement to the markets, but also by way of our website, but also emails to all of our members, those that we have email addresses for at least, so that they were aware in particular of the fact that that their personal details, contact details, dates of birth have been compromised. For us, I think the the ability to be as transparent as we can with members is actually quite helpful, because you're not then distracted by having to work out what can we say, what can't we say in the same way. And that's why we're very keen to continue to be as open as we can.
If I may add one point actually to Dominic's account as well, is that we use the opportunity whilst we were still going through this tack to actually get all of the CIOs and all of the IT directors of all of the independents, and offered to have a call with them to actually explain to them all of the different signatures that we'd witnessed and what we were able to do to better mitigate that. We then went on actually to do that with a number of other retailers as well. It was just, again, those channels for me, the biggest learning is always how do you, this is not a taboo subject, how are you able to communicate clearly what you're able to do, what you've learned to others, so that you prevent that from being a systemic implication. But we absolutely did that with.
Absolutely, and well, I'm sure we'll come on to it at some point, but that information sharing is, I think, going to be increasingly critical.
Good point. Just, you may have been in the earlier session. I'm just keen to understand the differences and similarities from your response to M&S's response and what we can learn from that. You gave me some of the dates, the timeline. So April 25th, that's when the attack started. You became actively aware on the 25th. So it wasn't just your systems were working, it was you as people understood that that was happening.
100%. So I can give you the dates and times at 7 o'clock. We're literally within minutes of that, our systems had alerted us automatically, and then the teams logged in. So within an hour of them doing malicious content, clearly initially they would look like a colleague, but this was within literally minutes of the initial.
And then how long after that did you then alert the authorities that this was happening?
So that was over the course of the weekend. So the following day, it might have been Sunday, actually, the NTA and the NCSC were informed. We updated the ICO and our other regulators, FCA, SRA, GCA, on Monday, and various other government departments. So, as quickly as we were aware.
Great. And then you said it was a few days until you then let your customers, owners know.
Yeah, so in that initial period, there was actually, as Rob mentioned, very limited impact directly, and at that point we hadn't established that any member data had been accessed. As soon as we'd established that on the Friday, through the ongoing forensic activity which Rob referred to, and at that point it was the same day that the additional action that Rob took to effectively close down our systems, which then had the operation impact. That was the point at which we put out the announcement and made sure that all our members were aware of the impact on them as members, both from a data and a operations perspective.
What date was that then?
That was the Friday, which would be the
on Friday from the
2nd of May. 2nd of May.
Excellent. It sounds like you'd spoken to other retailers. You mentioned that, Rob, there. So when you discovered the problem, did you alert other retailers in your sector that this was happening to you, and the signatures that you could see?
Yeah, clearly we have there's a trust group amongst security professionals and retail. They were able to share some of the information there, but also the NCSC facilitated a number of introductions of others that would benefit from the knowledge we had in the weeks preceding and the week immediately afterwards.
And it sounds like your systems were segregated, so that helped you withstand some of the
I mean, there's always opportunities and learnings to increase segregation, but yes, as I say, all of our online services were clearly ring-fenced as well. Our payment systems are air-gapped, and a number of our sub-businesses will be on different segments of the network, which helped.
And asked this to M&S as well. In House of Commons yesterday, the Right Honourable Member for Goole and Pocklington warned that cyber attacks and ransomware attacks on major companies are happening, and he said, I quote, that it's come to my attention that one such company has paid a very large sum to its blackmailer recently. Can I ask, was that you?
No, it was not. We did not pay a ransom. We did not contemplate or at any point discuss paying a ransom. And in fact, we didn't engage at any point with the criminal attackers through the process.
Great. And my last question is, were you able to access adequate support from the government from the moment this attack started?
I mean, I'm probably best to take that. So, yeah, I mean, the NCSC had assigned a representative to work with us pretty much immediately after we notified them on the weekend. So they were engaged on Monday. In fact, I met with both myself and Shireen met with both James, who's here today, from the NCA, but also Nick, who runs the NCST I think it was around about the 6th of May. But the teams throughout have been really supportive. Clearly, the biggest role they're able to play with us is that information sharing. We clearly were sharing more information probably than we were gleaning at the time, but other occasions where they've been incredibly helpful to help us with different pieces of information or intelligence that they're aware of in a safe manner.
And more broadly, I mean, the rest of our regulators have been supportive and understanding. They're asking all the challenging questions which you'd expect them to ask. And I think, by virtue of having a good relationship ongoing with those regulators, actually, I think it's important for both sides to have that level of trust. We've also had a number of government departments reach out to make sure that we have the support that we need, or if there's anything they can do. So from our perspective, yes, the response from government has been supportive and helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So we're living in a sort of a technical world, and cybersecurity is going to be one at the forefront to ensure that businesses are secured for the future. Can you walk me through what you think we should be doing for UK businesses to increase resilience? So from a prophylactic point of view, from a point of entry to an alert system to then recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you some of my thoughts on the topic. So I think awareness and preparation we talked about is absolutely critical. So being able to run those simulated exercises, knowing what roles individuals will play, but also that layered security posture. So making sure that you have different lines of defense and that you're not just relying on prevention. I think the other thing that is key here is we often look at cybersecurity as being, it's all about these cyber tools that will prevent everything from occurring. Actually, one of the biggest vulnerabilities, and we heard earlier from the last session, is around legacy systems, and actually they generally have vulnerabilities in them that may no longer be patched. So definitely staying on top of your IT estate, and by that I mean making sure that you are patching regularly when security updates are provided and ensuring you monitor that, but also in ensuring that you are removing that legacy where there aren't patches, etc., being provided, to make sure that you continually refresh and modernize your estate. I still think there's other things government and certainly businesses can do. There's a real opportunity in the UK. We've got some incredibly smart people leaving schools and universities who've got an amazing skill set. And I think there's, I was really reassured to see some of the cyber growth plans and initiatives. And I think that the more we can do to help turn, the next generation of the smart skills we have in the UK to be, I guess, more defenders rather than attackers, and educate them as the opportunities. There are a lot of unfilled roles in cybersecurity to date, and cybercrime is a growing opportunity and threat. And I think that the more people we can encourage in the UK to move into that sector will help us as a nation be able to have the skills and expertise we need to face these ongoing threats.
And anything in terms of the recovery point of view, anywhere we could be sharing communication or an alert system or mandatory reporting? Is there anything else from the recovery system and that part of the stage that you think we could be doing better?
So for us, as I said previously, we clearly work really closely with the NCSC, so we notified them immediately. I would expect others to do the same. I think that's a great source of information for everybody. I do think more facilitated, collaborative. If you look across retail, yes, we may compete on certain items, but actually the opportunity in these types of threat is collaboration is key. So I think, more facilitated sessions. There are those. I think we'll see more of it. Other industry sectors potentially do more than we do today, but I'm seeing that change already. Apart from that, then for me, ensuring that your resilience, your business continuity is key. I think there are references earlier to the financial sector, which I'm clearly fully aware of. I spent quite a chunk working for the Bank of England as well, so I understand some of the policies in financial. For us, we're already actually looking at things of having alternative provided systems that are available, kind of break glass for your critical processes. And I think that's definitely an area of consideration that we are continuing to look at. I think the concept of relying on paper and pen in today's modern society isn't sustainable, and you will need to have an alternative air gap segregated different stack that you can rely on in the event of a crisis to keep your fundamental core services running.
I was just going to say that I think in terms of, it's for businesses and industries, and certainly within the retail industry like ours, to make sure that we're actually sharing that information. I think where government can support us to create the safe spaces to do so. I think part of the reason why it doesn't naturally happen is that there's nervousness around, well, you've either got a legal consideration or a competition consideration. How do we have this? What's the connection point at the point when it's all happening to be able to share those learnings and information? I think creating those safe spaces to do so would be a positive action that government could take. I think there's also, we touched before in the previous session on the mandatory reporting, which I think hand in hand, the carrot and the stick combination actually might create a better understanding across industries, so that, part of the tragedy is that sometimes these attacks occur and it's exactly the same thing that has happened to somebody else elsewhere, and people just didn't know that that's where the sophisticated means of attack had moved to.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just interested in picking up the point around insurance and the cover that it provided, and whether or not when you look back on the situation, you think we didn't have enough, or they wouldn't have covered us if. And I'm just trying to get to the bottom of where that is sitting in the support for businesses, and whether you think it worked in your case, fit for purpose, or whether actually you've got some flags that you'd like to raise around actually we might have been in a very different circumstances if something had happened.
Okay, so I mean, I'll say up front that we aren't expecting to make a significant recovery under an insurance policy, and the reality of the sort of the various risks which any organisation has is that, you know, this is obviously very high on ours as it is with others, and then you look at what the various impacts would be of that risk and what the various things you can do both to prevent it and also to mitigate once it has happened, and there's technical solutions to that, and insurance has a really important role to play in considering that. From our perspective, we've invested heavily, and I think it's played out very well for the investment that Rob and his team have made in the preventative measures, but also in the sort of the post-event response. We chose not to specifically insure against this event. Obviously, you can get insurance against all sorts of things, and you have to choose which the decisions are. It's important to say that that's not a reflection necessarily on the quality of the insurance cover which is out there for these sorts of events. It was just the business decision that was made, and that has a number of factors to it, including the impact of the risk, the likelihood of it arising, and also the strength of the balance sheet, which, you know, we've strengthened our balance sheet significantly over the last 2 to 3 years, as to where you decide you're going to put those preventative measures. So we will, of course, continue to look at all the various tools available. We will inevitably be investing heavily in cyber insurance in the future, in cyber protection in the future. Whether we decide to take out insurance will depend upon, again, that detailed analysis, rather than well, this has happened, so we must therefore insure against that specific thing in future.
Just to pick up on the likelihood on your risk register, did that match or has it changed?
So it is on the register as an incredibly likely event to happen. Obviously, then you have to work through there's not one type of cyber attack, and it's important to note, actually, because it hasn't come up today, we are subject to cyber attacks, as every business is, every single week. The nature of this one was quite different to the ones that we've seen elsewhere in its sophistication, but we know that we are going to be attacked. There's not even a probability question there. The question is how serious that attack could be, and then the resulting impacts which flow from it. So,
okay. Any other lessons or reflections for public policy that you think ministers need to absorb from the experience you've gone through?
The only thing I would stress again is actually the impact it has on the not only the victims of the business, but actually the people that work for it. And actually, don't underestimate those you speak to have been subject to such a thing. You really realise how important those colleagues are, but also you have great wellbeing support, but actually the need to provide additional support to colleagues throughout what is an incredibly tricky situation. And I don't think we appreciate the human factor that plays through these things. Very
Right, Rob, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much
for coming to give evidence today. That is much appreciated. That concludes Welcome to this third panel in today's Subcommittee on Economic Security hearings as we review cybersecurity policy in our country. Thank you very much indeed to our witnesses for joining us this morning. Sarah Edwards is going to open the questioning.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming. I just wanted to ask Professor Kieran, so you've described the transformation of China's digital attack capabilities as the most important change for Western cybersecurity in more than a decade. So what do you think the policy implications are of this change? And could you describe to us what you think that we need to know?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I think one point of history and one point of consequence. The point of history is that whilst we've been complaining in the UK and the wider West for 25 years about Chinese cyber operations, they've all been data exfiltration. They've just been stealing governmental and commercial information. And those are silent. The organization goes on functioning perfectly normally. So it's sort of strategic damage. If you, and I've been in this position as have others, if you have a discussion with the Chinese governmental interlocutor and complain about this, one of the things they'll say is we have never launched a disruptive cyber attack of the type that Marks and Spencer had suffered. And that is historically true. What has emerged in the last few years, uncovered by the Americans, but backed by our government and the other Five Eyes partners, is a plan, an operation, codenamed Volt Typhoon. That doesn't really matter. It's just one of the silly names that the cybersecurity industry gives these operations, which is essentially what some have called digital booby traps in critical infrastructure. And if you think back to the operations that you heard about this morning, particularly M&S, because the co-op, as you heard, was different. It amputated its leg, as Mr. Cooper put it. If you think back to M&S, it's kind of dozens or hundreds of those. The then head at the same time, which would be extremely uncomfortable nationally. So the then head of the US cybersecurity agency, CISA, Jen Easterly, just used the phrase everything everywhere all at once. And I think, and I'm sorry for particularly this time, the sort of, arguably distasteful analogy, but if you think back to the peak of international terrorism earlier in the century, at one point, the likes of Al-Qaeda became obsessed with very, very sophisticated and difficult operations like 9/11. And that, to some extent, saved us from further harm because they're quite difficult to do. Then they started doing simpler but devastating operations, such as the one we commemorated yesterday, such as the one in Madrid. And in cyber, there's kind of been the same thing. You look at some of the Russian operations against Ukraine over the years, they're very sophisticated. They take a year and a half, 2-3 years to do a bit of limited disruption to a power grid. It's possible, but it's very hard to do. You look at the sort of thing that happened to Marks and Spencer's, that happens to organizations all the time. You look at the criminals have given the nation states a playbook, and that's what Volt Typhoon is. So that's the sort of history and context. Conscious of time, so the policy implications, I think there are all sorts of one, but I'm going to focus on one, which is I obviously heard the chairman of M&S say that you can't always regulate your way to this, but I think sometimes public policy does have a role, and we're not starting from scratch. And I would argue, speaking only for myself, that we already have a body of law that incentivizes every organization, literally every organization, to prioritize the protection of personal data from theft. That's the way our law currently stands. And it does not incentivize them to prevent the disruption of critical services. Now, for critical infrastructure, there's a law pending from the government. I think that's welcome. But I think even in general, because it's fiendishly hard to work out which companies are critical and which aren't, and which bits of companies are critical and which aren't. I think at the moment, and the classic case in this is the Irish healthcare system of 2021, where the entire national healthcare system collapses in terms of scheduling appointments for vital healthcare. There's no regulatory breach by the public authority in charge. 4 days later, the criminals behind the attack release some medical data. That's a breach of the law. That's crazy. That's roughly where British law is in a lot of places right now. And so the incentives are all wrong. And if we're serious about economic security, I'm not downplaying the importance of data security, but we've prioritized it at the expense of continuity of service, and I believe that is wrong.
That's really helpful. Could I just follow up?
Extremely helpful conclusion. Yes, you follow on. I have some questions on that line too.
I was just wondering on that point when we're talking about that classification of what's critical, and if we take what we've just heard from two food retailers, at what point do you think that the government and the security agencies need to look at that as being a critical infrastructure attack. So, we had two, and then we had a delivery organization as well. How do you think we should quantify that?
I think it's really hard, which is one of the reasons why I think that just a law that says, something's critical is going to be hard. Now, in some areas, it's really obvious. Telecoms, there's one or two organizations that are household names. Probably not fair to name them, but it's pretty obvious who I'm talking about. If they go down, we're in deep trouble. Food is really interesting. We had this during COVID, where I was, at the start of COVID, I was still in government, and all the various agency heads who were in charge of various bits of protection looked at what's critical. And food obviously self-defines as a critical sector. There's not a single company in it that's on its own is critical. So food is an example of where it's a very, very hard thing to do, which is why I don't think there is some sort of public policy, straightforward answer that you can write a white paper about or write a memorandum about. I think some of the things you heard about from the previous two panels around cooperation within the sector, about having dynamic exchange with government where you kind of know it when you see it. So I don't think you can say if it had gone from Marks and Spencer's to the Co-op and then on to the Tesco, Sainsbury's, Lidl's or whatever, then it would have been a critical incident. I'm not sure there's ever going to be that point because it kind of depends on what it is. But we need to be able to have that dynamic process by which we know it when we see it.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So you've flagged some of the evolution of threats like Volt Typhoon from China. What are the other multiplying threats that the country faces in the cyber domain?
I think I'll highlight three quickly. One you've heard about all morning, which is the enduring criminal threat. I think a specific aspect of that is geography. From what we know in the public domain, the Marks and Spencer's and Co-op attacks were actually done by potentially arrestable English-speaking criminals. That's actually unusual, and I think if you ask people currently in office, they'll say that's still the minority. I think we have a structural problem, which is that, about 3/4 of the known ransomware come from Russia or near Russia and areas that we don't have law enforcement cooperation with. So the traditional approach to sending the police after some people and hope you arrest them, even in an international environment, doesn't work. So the police have to think more imaginatively and do disruption. So that's the first thing. And it sounds depressing, but there's not a great deal you can do about the source of that. You can do some really important tactical interventions, and the NCA have been brilliant at that, but that's an enduring problem, which means you have to defend. I think there's a second, the Russian state and a few others, the Iranian state, remain capable. They show some restraint. I know that may not be a popular thing to say, but that's what the evidence reveals. Russia did not turn its considerable firepower on the West when it invaded Ukraine to any great extent. There's some serious incidents in Poland and other places, but we would have again been talking about that had it happened to Britain in the last 3 years. And then I think if you're looking at longer term public policy, one of the things that has kept us in an uneasy equilibrium in cyberspace, in other words, there's been lots of harm, but rarely, we've never been here to discuss an absolute catastrophe of national or global proportions in cyberspace. One of the things that's kept that uneasy equilibrium is the fact that to do something really devastating, you have to be quite good. Or extremely reckless. And the small number of powers with the elite capabilities are never both of those things at the same time, however much we may dislike some of the governments. With the rise of AI-enabled cyber tools, the cost of being more than a nuisance, because a lot of this is nuisance value and so forth, but the cost of being a strategic threat goes down, so more people can do it. And you think about the motives and modus operandi of some of those groups, and you then think about them with more powerful cyber tools. Those would be the things I would worry about.
Can I come
Please.
in on that? Because
help us fill out the picture about the threats that we should be foreseeing in the next 5 to 10 years.
I would add to that the context of everything being connected these days and everything relying on digital technology to an extent, which we've heard before has just broadened the attack surface massively. So there are targets everywhere nowadays. And one of the resilient solutions is to go back to pen and paper, which comes with productivity and efficiency implications, obviously. The other thing that we're seeing at NCC Group and that our threat intelligence team is pointing to is the convergence of threat actor groups. So nation states working with cyber criminal groups, hacktivists being co-opted by criminals, and the ecosystem of adversaries, as it were, coming together to our detriment. And then I think the third aspect, and Kieran alluded to that slightly, is the greater availability of capabilities and tooling and the proliferation of commercial cyber intrusion capabilities in particular. Whereas before it took an adversary days and months on end to develop offensive capabilities, they are now off the shelf available to purchase on the market. Some on the legitimate market, some on the dark market or the slightly grayer market, and that is a real threat, which is partially where the UK government has instigated.
And just help us visualise this. So Marks and Spencers have just lost about 3 times the value of the Brinks Mat robbery. That's how much 300 million is. How many people would have been involved in an attack like the attack on Marks and Spencers, if you were guessing? Is it 1? Is it 10? Is it 100?
Excellent question. I wouldn't want to speculate, but maybe
I can try and answer that. From what we know in the public record about the retail attacks, it's sort of split into 2 parts of the kind of criminal supply chain. So there is this amorphous group, Scattered Spider, which people believe is mostly young English-speaking criminals in the West. They reportedly gained access to the retail victims, but then used off-the-shelf services from Russian cyber criminals to actually deploy the ransomware. So we're probably talking about a few individuals as part of the kind of initial access phase, and then there's probably a larger criminal enterprise supporting the actual ransomware.
And that's dozens of people, hundreds of people, an unknowable number?
I think it depends on the group. We do know quite a lot about some of these Russian ransomware groups because of leaks of internal chat data. So one such group, Conti, was very professionalized. I think the number of employees, and we call them employees because it was run like a business, there were dozens or even hundreds of people involved in that, with people having very sort of professionalized sort of roles and skill sets within the organization. In other cases, we may be talking about kind of single-digit numbers.
Would you add anything to the picture of the threats that we face that Kieran and Katrina has set out?
No, I don't think so. I think perhaps just one thing is to say, particularly on the criminal front, is, we can get quite caught up in, thinking about sort of AI-enabled cybercrime and how things will change in the future. A lot of the type of criminal tactics we've talked about today have not changed over the last 4 to 5 years because they haven't had to, because it remains highly lucrative, and our response has not really sufficiently changed to force them to change their tactics.
Okay, thank you. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Chair. Kieran, just interested, it's now, 10 years on since I think the NCSE was sort of first proposed, came into being 2 years later. Is it realizing what you imagined, or do you have any frustrations about sort of its reach, or how it is regarded by public sector, by government, by wider society?
Thanks for the question. I think there were probably 4 broad aims when it was set up. The first was to really lead and grip national incidents. Just before it was set up, we had Talk, which was the first British cyber incident to lead the news, and the government sort of machine was kind of absent from that. So the first was incidents. The second was protection of critical infrastructure. The third was sort of giving one-to-many advice to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to get cybersecurity advice, charities, schools, sort of small organizations. And the fourth was to try and fix things that the commercial market wouldn't, so protections for small organizations, small public authorities. I think you can always do better. I think some of the highlights, I think if you look at some of the handling of major incidents. I recall the head of Redcar Cleveland Council, which was one of the most serious cyber attacks in the history of this country because vulnerable children's services were at risk, giving evidence in what it was to a joint committee, so I don't know which House of Parliament it was in, but saying that, you know, the NCSC, where we deployed a team who sort of slept in the office until it was done, were the most helpful bit of government. I think there've been things on, for example, there's another typhoon called Salt Typhoon, which is a major Chinese spying attack on the US. And in the US, the commercial incentives to thwart that attack on the telecoms, on the telecoms companies, their commercial incentives are zero. You know, America suffered a huge strategic spying breach, and companies, it doesn't cost them anything because it was spying, so they didn't suffer any loss of service or anything like that. So they have no incentive to do anything about it. Because of the sort of partnership that the NCSC built with the British telecoms industry, Parliament passed the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Act 2022 that said, look, if you want us to make these improvements to stop this sort of thing happening, build it into the regulatory model. So I think that's a good example of partnership. I think in terms of frustrations, I think, you know, you'll never have, and you heard a little bit of this morning, you'll never have the capacity to grip as many incidents as you want to. And I think there's still a little bit, I mean, I'm not sure I would go as far as Australia has done in terms of law, but I'll just give you the example for comparison purposes. The UK system is by and large quite collaborative, but in the event of a major incident, to use your phrase, Chairman, of public risk in private hands, it's essentially cooperative. And Australia, alive to that danger, has introduced what they call a power of consequence management. In other words, the government can declare that if something is going really badly wrong, but the primary levers of it are in private hands, they can essentially take over that aspect of it in the public interest. And I don't think we need to go that far in the UK because it's generally cooperative, but I think there can be a sort of messiness about the public-private interaction. Where does the corporate interest stop and the public interest begin, etc.? And we need to manage that very, very carefully. And I think one thing that we need to keep momentum on, and this isn't just a UK point in terms of the NCSC, but the transition of administration in the US makes this harder, which is something around fundamental problems with the top of the tech stack. And what I mean by that is there are breaches and incidents that you'll hear about that are Microsoft's fault. They're well-known examples. I'm not just picking on them. That are the telecoms company's fault. That are, you know, the big data moving company's fault, and they have no liability at all. So you can suffer things because of your upward provider, and that's not covered by any laws anywhere. The previous US administration is very interested in tackling that. The current administration isn't. So I think us and other like-minded authorities really need, if we want to make strategic breakthroughs, it's to the point that we've heard all morning about legacy tech and legacy systems and you know, unaccountable software providers and so forth. We have to try and make a dent in that, and that's going to be hard. So look, like any picture, it's mixed. I think there's plenty that, you know, the NCSC, including the long period since I've gone, can be proud of, but things are changing, and I think we really need to be wanting to grip that strategic tech security picture.
Just on that final point, you're talking about sort of the tech stack and what's happening in the US. Is the EU doing more interesting stuff in that arena?
It is, and it's early days. And so far, unlike other bits of controversial in EU-US terms legislation like the Digital Markets Act and so forth, American big tech isn't screaming about it. So there's something. It's a very odd name for the legislation, because it's called the Cyber Resilience Act, which makes you think about recovery from attacks. So it's actually nothing to do with that. The Cyber Resilience Act is essentially a transfer of liability act. So if the big American tech providers sell faulty products into the European market, they will be held liable for them. Now, it's only just come into force in its most basic narrow function, so it's too early to tell. But it's not, doesn't seem to be at the top of the list of US complaints about extraterritorial regulation of EU tech. And when you talk to EU officials and indeed some of the US tech giants about this, they say, well, we kind of think in 10 years' time we're going to be here anyway. So we might as well make this work because it's clearly sensible. Now, it's really difficult. It is a difficult technical challenge. There was a big thing, Katerina mentioned it, around, everything's interconnected. And with IoT, with Internet of Things stuff, it's hardware. So it can be easy to do it can be easier to do product regulation. If you talk to Microsoft and they say, how are you going to provide an incentive and penalty regime for 90 billion lines of code? You're going to find an error in line 54 billion and say, right, you're fine. It's going to be really hard to do this. But I think that's one of the critical areas. And I don't think it's just the EU, because obviously there's sensitivities here and that. Singapore is interested in this stuff, Australia, Canada, they're all interested in this stuff. So there is an opportunity to work on what is known in the trade as secure by design, to try and make progress on this area.
And it's worth just mentioning that the DCID in the UK published their software security code of practice a couple of months ago, which goes into that territory of incentivizing through a voluntary code at this point in time, but incentivizing software developers and procurers of software to pay attention to secure by design features in that software.
Okay. Just to build on that, I think there is a lot of work going on in the NCSC and DCIT, but it is all voluntary at the moment on this particular issue.
Just to follow up for you, Katerina and Jamie, just in terms of as external independent observers of the NCSC, what your take is on the impact it's having across society, across business, public sector.
I have to say, and NCC Group have been a private sector partner to the NCSC from the outset, but the way in which public-private collaboration was built into the design of the NCSC through the Industry 100 initiative in particular is pretty remarkable. And from where I'm sitting is something that international delegations come to the UK to learn more about, and learn about how the NCSC in particular has managed to create a shared sense of mission with the private sector, and has created an environment in which private sector participants are partners, not just providers or not just solution offerers, but are true partners in the endeavor of cyber resilience, which is something to be very proud of. And it wasn't on the list of objectives that Kieran mentioned from the outset, but I think it is a very happy byproduct of the work of the NCSC.
Thank you. Jim?
I think that the NCSC is very admirable in a lot of ways, and probably still kind of world leading when we look at kind of national technical authorities and national cybersecurity centres. I think particularly in terms of working on technical challenges that don't have obvious commercial implications for cybersecurity, there's very positive examples where the NCSC has led on that kind of thing and been ahead of industry. And one example of that at the moment would be preparing for post-quantum cryptography. I think there's also been a lot of success stories about being measured about potential cyber threats. I would look at the experience with Huawei and 5G in 2019 as a good example of that. I know Kieran probably doesn't want to relive that experience, but the kind of technical assurance that went into that work, the way it was conveyed to the public and to industry, I think was very positive. I think in terms of potential challenges and downsides, I think if you look at statements from NCSC leadership and annual reports over the last couple of years, there seems to be a lot of frustration that the guidance and advice they're putting out is not cutting through and not being taken up. And I think generally awareness of the NCSC among the majority of UK businesses is still very low as well.
What's your estimate of small businesses' awareness?
Yeah,
you have a good stat on that.
I do have a stat on that. The DCIT Cyber Breaches Survey 2025, when asking respondents for their sources of information, 1% of businesses and 2% of charities mentioned NCSC by name.
Thank you.
Awareness of their campaigns is higher, but by name, it's pretty low. And I think that was reflected in the earlier evidence sessions, that within the cyber community, the NCAC is very well known and incredibly well respected, and there is a community around it. Awareness in the broader realms of society is still relatively limited. And I do think there is a role private sector partners can play in acting as ambassadors and multipliers and amplifiers. And that's probably something that's currently untapped.
Yeah, okay. Charlie Maynard.
Yes, well, thank you. And NCSC, I'm one of those people that this is new to, so that's helpful. And I'm getting warm and fuzzy feelings, but I think just to be here, in terms of risks and in terms of concerns, you've mentioned quite a few and they've been very interesting, very useful. What else have you not mentioned in terms of where we are going in the future and what we need to be thinking about?
First go. You want to have a first go then?
You go.
I think one thing that would concern me at the moment, and also to go back to Kieran's opening example with Volt Typhoon, is in what ways is the British state preparing for a sort of crisis or kind of conflict scenario with another state, and what kind of regulatory mechanisms is it creating where we can have much more direct control of parts of the cybersecurity of critical national infrastructure in a conflict scenario. I would be concerned that work is not happening at the moment, particularly given how much of not just CNI is privatized, but also the kind of cybersecurity services and capacities that we have in the UK.
And what's your take on the Australian example and pros and cons of that?
I mean, I haven't looked at it in enough detail, but reflexively would think that it's a good idea.
Okay.
I would be interested to see, because the forthcoming cybersecurity and resilience bill, from what we understand, will include a power to intervene of some description. Detail is currently lacking, but I'll be very interested to see what that entails and whether that goes some way towards the Australian example Kieran mentioned. In terms of broader concerns, I don't think we have an overarching view of the collective capability that is available to the UK at the moment, and that looks at what is available via agencies like NCSC or the NCA or intelligence services, that looks at the private sector. No one has done the stock-taking exercise, as it were, and looked at collective capability and how that measures up to what we're likely to see from adversaries.
Just a couple of things that are worth watching out for. One is what I would call random malicious accidents. And what I'm referring to there is less responsible attackers unleashing something that's badly coded, which then goes globally and it's not targeting anybody. We had 2 of those in 2017. We had the so-called WannaCry virus, which affected the NHS here. We had NotPetya, which affected all sorts of, WPP advertising, DLA Piper, the law firm, but globally it took out Maersk, the shipping sort of company, and so forth. And that is one of the risks with cyber, where, you can analyze threats and so forth, but some of the most important incidents we've had to deal with, to Jamie's point about readiness, have just been malicious accidents. In other words, they were targeting somebody else, but they ended up targeting everybody. I would also, given that I suppose we're the segue between the recent victims and the serving government officials, I think the point that's come up a couple of times today about insurance is really vexed and but potentially interesting one for future opportunities, and it speaks to the wider problem that a lot of the technology is there for cyber defense, but a lot of the problems are sort of economic, social, quasi-regulatory, commercial incentives, all that sort of stuff. And I recall in 2014, actually, before the NCC was set up, and so this dates it, Francis Maud, then Minister for Cybersecurity, hosting a summit of insurers at Marsh on the other side of town, and saying that Britain is very good at cybersecurity technically and really good at financial services, including insurance. You should be able to put the two together to give a big shield. And for reasons that are sort of nobody's fault, and nobody's acted malevolently, but it's certainly not achieved its potential. And part of that, and this speaks to, I know I didn't mention it as one of the 4 priorities, but Kat's point about the informality, there is a strength of the informality about the British system. So in the US, everybody is litigating everything. And if you want to do any cooperation between the government and the company or between companies, They want some legal guarantee. In the UK, people rarely seek that, and it kind of works. But I think building on that, I'll give you a specific example in insurance. About 4 years ago, the insurance industry went down globally as a result of that not pettier attack. They went down this complete rabbit hole about what was an act of war in cyberspace, even though it was pre-invasion of Ukraine. So there was no sort of, in terms of where the phrase act of war comes from in insurance history, we didn't have any of those. And when it came out, it just was written in a language that neither the government nor the cybersecurity industry understood. And there's no reason for that. You know, it should be, given that the UK is actually quite collaborative in cyber defense attitudinally, you should be getting the insurers, the experts, the academics, the government people, the cybersecurity industry, and the big corporate victims saying, look, here's what the last 10 years of revealed history have shown us. This is what nation states do. Here's the incredibly murky and incomprehensible grey area between nation states and criminals hosted by those nation states. How are we going to get a workable insurance model out of this? And we haven't quite had that sort of conversation. And I think it's something really, if you're interested in public-private collaboration in the interest of UK economic security, that is a really strong area of potential if we got this right.
Brilliant. Just a very quick aside, the National Security Strategy published recently talks about how quickly the country may need to move from cooperation to competition to crisis. The National Cybersecurity Centre was a novel institution that brought together the public and the private sector around a particular domain of cyber. Do you think it's a potentially useful model for thinking about economic security more broadly?
If you adapt for different incentives in different sectors, yes. And at the risk of making myself sound ridiculous, but I mean, my early government career was in the Treasury, and there's almost an attitude there that, the private sector is amoral and exists to generate revenue for the government to spend. If you work in something like cybersecurity, you realize that, of course, major corporations, the people who were there this morning, particularly M&S is a listed company, they've got to make money, they've got to make returns. But if you approach them sensibly on issues of national security, they instinctively want to be in the right place and they want to do the right thing, and they'll give you the cooperation that you need. And sometimes we actually overcomplicate that dialogue. I think in my early days in office, I overcomplicated it because you thought, well, where does again, this question of where does public risk start and private risk end? There's always going to be a big overlap. You can sit around writing a memorandum about that, or you can actually go and do stuff. And I think in cyber, partly because we were blessed with it's quite a technical subject, it was seen as quite important, but not widely understood. And it wasn't an issue. It wasn't a political fault line. We had quite a lot of space to engage with big business. They didn't, to their enormous credit, seek legal protection for doing it. And we said, look, if this gets lawyerly, we'll have to call it off because we can't do it. And I do think that there was a very strong attitude. Interestingly, for a country where a lot of chief executives are not British nationals, it didn't really matter. Mm-hmm. If you went to a big corporate that was chaired or had a CEO who was not a British national, they still often wanted to do the right thing. Obviously you had to exercise prudence with what you shared with them. But I do think there is a model that can be replicated subject to adaptations for all the sectors. Yeah.
Just want to pick up on the point about sort of businesses and how they interface with NCSC, but how good they are at using cyber threat intelligence and the assessment in making decisions, and how effective the NCSC is in informing that process. Maybe we can start with you, Katerina.
It's a really, it sounds like an easy question, but I think it's quite a complex question because it will depend on the maturity of the receiving organization and what it can and can't do with it. And depending on that level of maturity, different kind of hand-holding mechanisms, I think, are needed. So relatively mature organizations will receive a threat assessment from the NCSC. They might have their in-house threat intelligence teams who can go through the intelligence cycle and enact whatever needs doing on the basis of that actionable intelligence they received. Smaller or less mature organizations will struggle with that. And I think that is something Kieran pointed to, the lack of resource or the lack of capacity on the NCSC side. That's something that is still a struggle because the information is being put out there into the ether, to be done something meaningful with. And a lot of receiving organizations see it and think, this seems really important, but what exactly is it that you would like me to do? Which I go back to, I think there is a role for private sector partners, more mature private sector partners, whether they come from the cyber industry, whether they come from big businesses, to be that bridge between here's what NCSC is doing and saying, here's what you need to do. We'll do that translation layer and make that intelligence actionable for a less mature organization.
Try not to overcomplicate this. I think there's some brilliant examples. So there's one, it's a while ago now because it was in my time, but it's 2018, where a North Korean group that's well known for being the most accomplished monetary cash thieves in global cyber, the so-called Lazarus Group, have a go at the City of London. The NCSC detect anomalous activity on the SWIFT system, spread it out to the banks. 54 banks that are under attack, block all of it. But to Katarina's point, that's 54 of the wealthiest institutions in this country with the strongest capabilities. So again, it comes back a lot to a lot of this to sort of, economic, social, commercial incentives. And what I think you can't do, and we used to do this, and to some extent we still do, not just us, but other states as well, we then take medium and small businesses, and if you look at sort of the expectations, it's to be able to do something that a government or a very large corporation is only able to do, and that's not fair. So whilst in one respect, the statistic about 2% of small businesses or charities, whatever, knowing about some of this stuff might sound depressing, there's part about realistic expectations on them, and that's where I think when it comes to, I think in terms of really important sectors, finance and telecoms are mature and strong relationships. I think energy, certainly in my time, wasn't. I don't know if it's changed. Water wasn't. There were other critical sectors where it was much less mature. I think when you get further down into smaller organizations, you actually have to look for different solutions. It is striking, even in the United States, nobody has made money, serious money, selling cybersecurity to small businesses. It's and it baffles venture capitalists and so forth. So, and I think we've been at this for so long, you can ask the same question over and over again, or maybe you should look for a different question and a different answer. And that's where the whole just make the stuff they use a bit more secure and help them out when they're in serious trouble. There was an example in my time, there was a small documentary maker. It's since been bought by ITV, so it's part of a large company. But back then it was 25 people in Northern Ireland. They were making a documentary about the North Korean government. They attracted the attention of the same people who in 2014 famously took out Sony pictures because they didn't like the movie The Interview. I don't think there's any public policy framework you can construct that can easily protect a documentary making company of 25 people from the North Koreans. You just hope and expect that those cases are relatively rare, and you send the government in directly to help them. And you make the tech they use as good as possible, so the North Koreans have to work a bit harder. So I think it's different solutions for different bits of the market. I think we need to get better at the top end, bring everybody to the level of finance and telecoms. But I think as you go further down the economic sort of pyramid.
Like we heard from Marks and Spencer Co, were you surprised or reassured by what you heard of their experiences?
I'm very sympathetic to what they experienced. Again, they didn't go into details, and Jamie and I are just going what's been reported. It all seemed to have been so one key entry point for M&S is that unusually fluent, unaccented in terms of they didn't sound foreign or second language, native English speakers deceived the help desk. That is arguably preventable, but you can all understand the sort of tensions and trade-offs and how it happens. And then once they're in, it appears that the techniques used were very, very sophisticated because they're looking like a normal user. Sometimes called living off the land. You look absolutely normal. And that can be very, very hard to detect. I'm not critical about the recovery time. I think it's perfectly normal, to take that length of time. But I think I am worried, and it comes back to the point of the exchange with right at the very start. I am worried about what it says about national vulnerability. I mean, M&S can and have looked after themselves. They've made their announcements. They're still trading well, you know, they're and so forth. But the criminals have given us a playbook here that you can disrupt an iconic British brand with, you know, some effort, but effort that is comfortably within the easy reach of adversaries. And what is also in the easy reach of state adversaries is to do this on multiple occasions at the same time. And that is the worry.
Jamie, anything to that?
Just on the threat intelligence aspect, I would not underestimate the extent to which the state and NCSC is dependent on the private sector for a lot of the threat intelligence that it consumes. So obviously NCSC benefits enormously from GCHQ's signals intelligence collection, and then I guess more forward-facing cyber operations that the UK conducts. But in terms of the intelligence that is generated from incidents, which is a lot of the threat intelligence that the private sector produces, we are very dependent on large US cybersecurity vendors to generate that.
Okay, do you want to just nail the insurance question? I think we've covered a bit of it.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So
nail that to the floor.
The Professor talked about insurance there, and made, I think, a quite powerful argument for convening perhaps government, private industry, and the insurers, and drawing them together as we face this threat. But if I could come to you, Jamie, because in 2023, the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy used evidence from RUSI to warn that there was a difficulty in the insurance market with demand outstripping capacity and insurers raising premiums and setting tougher conditions for coverage. That situation, I presume, is only going to worsen now, as we've heard, with big claims coming through. I just wonder where we are with that and what your thoughts are on that idea of convening some sort of big powwow about this whole insurance situation.
Yeah, so I did a lot of research on cyber insurance from sort of 2020 to 2023. And I do think the market conditions have changed since we gave that evidence. And my understanding is that the market has softened again. So some of those market conditions have essentially reversed, which means it's easier to obtain cyber insurance. Although, based on media reporting, I think it's interesting that for a company of Marks and Spencer's size, they were only able to obtain coverage that covered a portion of their losses, because the market is still not offering very significant coverage. So conditions have improved, I think, in terms of being able to obtain coverage. The downside of that, if the market is softening, is that it means that insurers will not be asking for kind of security controls, perhaps across all market segments. So they won't necessarily be driving up security standards in the way that we.
So there might be some market failure that requires a bit of state intervention.
I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say it's market failure. It's more just how a private market reacts to market conditions, and when they experience losses, they need to underwrite they need to ask for more controls to reduce losses. When the conditions are opposite, they don't need that. Yeah. And so that's like relying on the insurance market to solve cybersecurity. I think it's a bit of it's not going to be the silver bullet that a lot of people have kind of treated it as historically.
To that point, I mean, you think that the market itself is in a reasonable shape, that there's no need for intervention in terms of government actually putting money in. And I'm thinking now of things like when the government stepped in to provide cover for private buildings when the IRA were having a bombing campaign here in the UK. You don't think we're at that point yet, but do you think there's a way of the government perhaps using the insurance companies to drive up, incentivizing, for instance, better controls, better systems to protect against this kind of thing?
I think, so on the first question, I don't think the market conditions are at the point where we need a kind of a government backstop in the way that we did with Pool Re. I don't think we are experiencing a market failure where organizations can't obtain cyber insurance in the way that they could for terrorism and property damage. So I think there's still room for the market to grow organically, which I don't think we need that kind of intervention, but Kieran may disagree.
I'm not sure whether to go as far as to say it's a market failure, but maybe I'm just being overly semantic. I certainly wouldn't say it's a fully working market in terms of the public interest. I don't think we're at backstop territory, but I do think there are a number, and this comes back to, at least as a first step, have a proper, serious sort of cross-sectoral dialogue. I think there are a number of problems. I mean, I mentioned an example about how to insure for nation-state threats, which still rumbles on. I think there are real issues. You go back to data harm versus disruptive harm. I mean, Marks and Spencer has been very clear how much disruption costs them, but when you're insuring for data losses, what are you measuring and so forth? And we've struggled with that. And I still think, and again, Jamie may disagree, so we'll have to, cauterize this debate at some point. But when you look at some of my impressions, talking to a lot of customers and insurers, some of the things in terms of when things go wrong and insurers are looking for more can be a bit sort of compliance heavy. Have you done this risk assessment, that risk assessment? And actually under incentivize, there's some really good tools, technical tools out there that companies can use. So take the M&S example of living off the land, looking like a normal user. There's some very powerful internal tools that people are now adopting that say, right, okay, hang on, that looks like a normal user. It's a little bit weird what they're doing at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. How do you incentivize, having some of that good stuff? So I don't think you have to reach straight for the terrorism style government backstop yet, but I still think there's scope for technocratic improvements in the current system. We don't, unusually for the UK, because I think, as others have been kind enough to say, under the NCSC's leadership, in lots of other areas of cybersecurity, there is a good, strong partnership environment where you convene and make improvements. I haven't quite seen it completely work in insurance yet.
So you are almost out of time, but Charlie Maynard,
Yes, just following up on Jamie's comment about it dependent on what the private sector tells NCSC or whoever it may be. And earlier people were talking about mandatory reporting. And I'm just kind of wanting your take as to, do you think that should be something that should be regulated so that essentially private companies do have to report if there have been breaches?
Yeah, and I mean, the government just ran a consultation on ransomware specifically, where one of the proposals is that UK organisations would have to report a ransomware incident. I guess there's still questions to be worked out around what the threshold would be. I would personally expand that to all malicious cybersecurity incidents. I don't know why. I don't really understand the logic of just applying that to ransomware. I think the fact that we can have a publicly listed company in the room today and we can't really get a clear answer out of them about whether they paid a ransom or not, I think is a bit telling of the current reporting environment that we are existing in.
Any other final views on that?
I mean, I think very quickly, I think it's one of those rare instances of public policy which is very little downside to it. Australia, sorry to keep mentioning Australia, but I did this work for free, but I helped the Australian government 2 years ago with their strategy. They've just introduced it. It's been enforced for 2 months. The sky hasn't fallen in. And I think, the NCSC and the wider, the NCA capabilities are national assets, and anything we can do to strengthen them helps. And actually, not just the sort of situation Jamie just talked about, but actually having a richer data set where you get towards those hidden events will help strengthen them at very little cost. It's not a huge bureaucratic burden on affected entities, so I don't see the case against it.
Most accidents have to be reported. That takes us out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you so much to this panel for a brilliant set of evidence, both illuminating and alarming, both at the same time. That concludes this. This final panel today for our subcommittee on economic security. Thank you very much indeed to our witnesses who are joining us from the National Cybersecurity Centre, from the City of London Police and from the National Crime Agency. We're extremely grateful to you for what you do and for your time today. Matt Weston is going to open the question.
Thank you, Chair. A question for you, Richard, if I may. The government talks about the whole of society approach to this challenge. How do you think the resources that we're deploying in sort of private and also public sector, in terms of investing in our capabilities, how do you think they are matching against the investment of our adversaries?
So that's a challenging question to give a simple answer to. I'll try. I think there is. We talked in our last annual review about a growing gap, and that is, on the one hand, we have a growing dependency on technology across all of our society, and therefore a growing exposure to the impact of cyber attacks. So the kind of cyber attacks you see today have a greater impact because we're more dependent on technology. So if you take the technology away, it causes a greater impact. And also the threat actors are developing at pace, the market's evolving for criminals, and it's an expanding threat landscape. On the other hand, I think what we're seeing is a steady increase in our defenses across our society and our ability to defend and be resilient against cyber attacks. But I think there is a growing gap between the two, and we talked about that in our annual review back in November.
We heard just now 1% of small businesses are aware of the NCSC. Is that a surprise to you? And what do you need to do to actually build awareness? If we are going to have a whole of society approach, it has to be, as we know, the smaller business may be vulnerable, but of course small businesses supply larger businesses, and that can affect the larger business operation.
So I think for me, I'm less concerned about their awareness of us, and I'm more concerned about their awareness of what we're saying. And I think that same research did acknowledge that they're much more aware of our campaigns. So schemes like Cyber Essentials, which we have a scheme of over 400 accredited companies, many of which are also small businesses, which are there to help businesses get cyber essentials in place and deal with the fundamentals of cybersecurity. So I think there would be greater awareness of schemes like that. And that's what matters to me, is that organizations are aware of the schemes and the advice. Now, having said that, there's still a long way to go to raise the awareness for us across the UK as to what organizations need to do for their cybersecurity.
Just finally, if I may, Chair, we just heard obviously from M&S, as you may have been in the room, about their situation with legacy systems. It's kind of typical of all organizations, and they were looking at the financial cost of doing that, but the cost that they've been hit in terms of to their business. What can government do to incentivize more investment in this sphere by business?
That is a great challenge, not just in business, but in government as well. You've seen the Public Accounts Committee report on government and government's own IT. It is a huge challenge, and organizations that are sort of racing to modernize, to digitize, you always have this challenge of, do I invest in replacing legacy, which might not give me any advance on my mission, as it were, or do I adopt AI and new technologies? And it is a real challenge. And I think one thing I'm really aware of in the NCSC is, over the last year, we've shifted to a stronger message to boardrooms. So a lot of the work that the NCSC has done over many years has been engaging with professionals across and IT people across the country. I think there's a much greater need now for a stronger message to boards around the urgency and the importance to act and the importance to invest. So we've been working with DCIT on a code of governance, for a code of practice for governance of cybersecurity. And there's other initiatives we're taking to really try and drive the message into boardrooms much stronger.
Okay, that's very helpful. Can you just help us now contextualize this and talk us through some of the threats that we should foresee over the next 5 to 10 years? Richard, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, so
give us a bit of horizon scanning.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the high level message is it's diverse, it's dynamic, it's changing. We see, and it's almost kind of a bit too simple to say nation state and criminal now. You have sort of nation state directed activities, and some of the previous conversation focused on some of that. Then you have sort of private enterprises that create capability that nation states buy. So the proliferation of attack tools to enable often smaller nation states to undertake activity. And as well, we've seen a lot of the bigger nation states using private enterprises to enable their attacks.
Almost like mercenaries.
Almost like mercenaries, absolutely. Then there's sort of nation state aligned, where often called hacktivists, where we've seen that particularly in Russia, but elsewhere in the world, where you have groups of individuals, criminals who are independent of the state. They're not acting to make money. They're acting in the interests, aligned interests of the state, as it were, attacking people who attack our state kind of thing. And then you have what I would call nation state sheltered, maybe. A lot of the ransomware groups, for example, operate in countries where they benefit from some kind of protection from the nation state, but not necessarily direction. And then you have sort of individuals, and it's really quite a broad spectrum. And we start to see sort of trading within it. So it's a marketplace rather than a sort of a clearly defined black and white.
And the threat's going up.
Yes.
Yeah. And how does this show up in your world?
Yeah, may I add to that from the perspective of serious organised crime? So in the NCA, we look across the range of serious organised crime threats, and we formally publish on this every year. But one of the things we say is that the thing that is most affecting how serious organised crime is growing is not so much what the criminals are doing, but us, the public, our own dependence on online services, our own use of them, and our use of other services that depend on them. So if you look across the whole range of online crime, not just cybercrime, but fraud and child sexual abuse online and other crimes of that sort, you can see that those are in general rising. And the sort of limiting factors that there have been in the past are sort of falling away. So particularly on fraud, and I'll come back to cyber in a second. Previously the number of criminals in a boiler room would be the limiting factor. Now perhaps the number of people trafficked across international boundaries unwillingly to do fraud is the limiting factor. AI is taking some of those limiting factors out of the equation. Specifically on cybercrime.
Can I just check? So you're saying that fraudsters are being imported into particular countries?
Yes, in Southeast Asia and in West Africa. That's right. Yeah. People being conned into going and working in scam compounds. Okay. But increasingly, AI allows you to automate some of the earlier stages of that. As far as cybercrime is concerned, we actually believe that the cybercrime threat was level between 2023 and 2024. It has been rising for many years. That's probably a short-lived plateau, but it is a significant success, and it is worth dwelling on it. And as your earlier witnesses have said, the bulk of cybercrime affecting the UK is foreign in origin, particularly Russian-speaking in origin, and it is that's where the threat largely has levelled off. There is, however, a growing but more sort of smaller level of threat from what we're calling English-speaking cyber actors, and I should touch on both parts briefly. If I cover the English-speaking cyber actors first, we have these comm networks, which are these, Scattered Spider is an example of a sort of cyber-focused comm network. These are loose networks of individuals, usually aged sort of...
The record is common networks.
Comm
networks.
That's what they call themselves. Yeah. Scattered Spider is what industry call them. Age sort of 15 to 25 or so, loose affiliations, doing it partly for profit, but as much for kudos. And it's sort of come out of gaming, I think, as people have said. I think the point to make is that it is very closely aligned with coercive and abusive behaviour of often vulnerable children. And it is to some degree the same social engineering techniques that are used on those children to abuse them that are then used by a smaller subset on companies to get into help desks in the way you have heard. To touch on the Russian-speaking cybercrime phenomenon, so what has gone on there, the sort of original cybercrime groups were very focused and sort of individual groups of people. Conti was mentioned earlier and is an example of that. That moved on to a ransomware as a service offering where you would have a set of people who would make it possible for any affiliate to do ransomware. And so Lockbit is a good example of that. 2,350 victims listed on their leak site over about 4 or 5 years, the biggest number of victims listed by any group. The NCA, working with a number of other law enforcement organizations around the world, disrupted them very substantially in early 2023, about the same time as the FBI, working with us and others, disrupted another group called Black Hat. We've seen a sort of fragmentation of that Russian ransomware ecosystem, hence the leveling off. And finally, Dragon Force, which plays a bit part in the Marks and Spencer's incident, as you've heard. That's almost taking this level of abstraction a step further. So it's making tools available for individual cyber criminals to build into ransomware. It lowers the barrier to entry, but it's even less of a sort of congregating factor than Lockbit was. And so when we first knew that there had been a Dragon Force message to Marks and Spencer's, they were put in touch with the relevant regional organised crime units in Yorkshire and Humber that we had tasked to lead on Dragon Force. They were able to say that the message was quite different to other messages they had seen from Dragon Force. That was sort of useful, but also to be expected in that the sorts of criminals using Dragon Force may be expected to be much more varied.
Very useful. Thank you. Mr. Gould, would you like to round out the picture of threats?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with what both Richard and James have said. I think what's interesting for us in terms of policing is, particularly in relation to the COM, what that means in terms of how that plays out locally. So you might have these national and international threats, but the impact is played out in terms of local victims. So thinking of the way, sort of thinking of around the COM, if you think of kind of traditional cybercrime, if there is such a thing, traditionally sort of ransomware purely focused on the cybercrime offending. Now there's kind of a more hybrid approach where they're offending across threat types. So you'll see, I can think of I'll be careful about what I say, that if there's a particular investigation by a Northwestern cybercrime team in a local force who've identified a number of individuals who are basically hacking into people's devices to then access intimate images. So that's a Computer Misuse Act offence, it's a hacking offence, but they're then extorting the young women whose images they are, making direct contact, and in that one investigation, there's 4,000 victims. Wow. So if you start to play that out, and there will be local force cybercrime units doing these sorts of investigations across the country, as well as ransomware, denial of service attacks, and all the kind of the traditional offending that we look at. Suddenly we're having to operate at scale in terms of managing victims as a small force team where you might have 10,000 victims in every force in the country. How do you manage that at that scale? And they're offending across crime type. There's domestic abuse, there's violence against women and girls, there's an incel element. It's the kind of the threat is diversifying and playing out into real world harms in the way that it hasn't in the past. So we're doing a lot of work with the NCA and government to think, how can we be more flexible operating along those threats, not working in kind of threat silos as policing sometimes traditionally has, and geographical silos as well.
Very helpful, thank you. Charlie Maynard.
Thanks all. Just kind of following up on that, if those barriers to entry just keep dropping, which it seems very probable, just sketch out how this looks in, say, 5 years' time in terms of how you try to stay ahead. I mean, it sounds almost like it's traditional policing in terms of it's just you're trying to identify who these people are and going after them, or is there much more than that? Or
no, I think it is different to that. So I don't know if you want to start, Richard, but I'll come to it from the
I'll maybe
crime
start
perspective.
from the defender's side, and James can touch on the sort of policing side. From a defender's perspective, I think one thing that's really interesting is that at the end of the day, the core techniques these attackers are using is not evolving that fast. And many of the attacks we see today are exploiting sort of vulnerabilities and configurations and issues with how your most privileged users administer systems and things like that were there 20 years ago. So a big part of, yes, the threat is rising overall, but actually what we need as defenders to do isn't changing that fast. And I think the biggest step change we can make is to get those fundamentals consistently rolled out in more organizations. And that's where schemes like the Cyber Essentials and having sort of those basics in place across as many organizations as possible does raise the barrier of entry from the defense perspective, even though the barrier of entry to gain access to the tools, as it were, is dropping.
So building on that, really the minority of the work we do is going after individual reports of cyber attacks and following them up and trying to find out what happened, because the work factor that is needed to do that is very large. And you may get to one or couple of individuals, or you may not. Of course, in a significant incident, we will either investigate ourselves or task it out to the broader system that Andrew has described. But the majority of the work we do, we would describe as being proactive, and that is going after the cybercrime ecosystem that allows these barriers to lower and allows these attacks to go ahead. So that's looking at the infrastructure, the hardware, systems, tools, and services that enable the cyber criminals, the financial services they use, particularly cryptocurrency, how they achieve their initial access and compromise, and the marketplaces and forums that they congregate in, share tactics, techniques, and procedures, share victim information in. And over the last few years, there have been a number of disruptions, takedowns, also arrests, also sanctions of individuals involved in those key ecosystem elements. Lockbit is just one example that I gave earlier. So on the day of Lockbit, we took down 11,000 domains, closed 14,000 nefarious accounts, identified and froze 200 cryptocurrency accounts, and took down 40 key servers across 9 countries. So that sort of impact then translates into the change that we then saw in what had been a doubling of ransomware year on year the previous 12 months.
And just running that into, you talked about kind of English language, Russian language as being 2 big blocks. Just sticking with the Russian language side of things, obviously that's across a number of countries, not just Russia. Is that just impossible to access, or actually you can access a lot of that? You can take things down in other states effectively. There are means of doing it, so it's not necessarily just kind of beyond reach. It's very much within reach with the right tools.
Yeah, cyber does sort of transcend geography, really. So any of these actors, whatever language they're speaking, will just naturally, without even really trying, be using infrastructure throughout the world. And then, of course, they do try to do that to make it complicated for us as well.
Okay. Mr. Cupid.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wonder, Mr. Babbage, if you're related to Charles Babbage, the inventor of the computer, it would be quite interesting. On funding, I just wondered what impact, if any, if the recent spending review is likely to have on your ability to deal with cyber threats, because the single intelligence account, which funds British intelligence services, got actually quite a substantial raise in that. What do you think is that going to impact? We'll start with you, Richard.
So yes, there's no question we have the funding to continue our mission and to continue to drive as hard as we can the cybersecurity across the UK. I think, to be perfectly honest, sort of the big funding leap we need to see is in the organisations and how they defend themselves across the UK, be that government departments, be it private sector organisations. I think you probably heard earlier reflections of organisations that have been breached, sort of realising they kind of knew what they needed to do but didn't realise the urgency. And we see that again and again. Sort of organisations need to understand the urgency of investing in cybersecurity, removing their legacy systems, and getting the fundamentals in place to give themselves a secure foundation for their growth and prosperity.
On the sort of Home Office and policing side, it's too early to say, really. The Home Office has a settlement, and we're in quite early stages of disaggregating that settlement and working with them on what the implications are across what is obviously a sort of enormous family of departments.
Yeah, and that brings me to kind of a follow-up point then, because while that national spending review did lift spending in some areas, longer term, you're looking at potential reductions of 15% in growth in departmental administration spending. So that obviously will be a concern. It's too soon to say, as you say, but you must be concerned about that.
Yeah, there are sort of 2 related funding issues from an NCA perspective specifically. The first is, can we pay our people enough to attract them and keep them in this line of work? And the work is very compelling, so that gives us a bit of a lift. But we've said publicly that we feel we need a different model than we have now, and we're working with sort of broader government on that. Our salaries are not particularly competitive against policing, or the UK intelligence community is still less industry, and so that's something we need to deal with.
Can you just give us some specifics on that? So pick a rank and tell us what the kind of salary range is for them.
I couldn't do that off the top of my head, but it is very different. The key difference also is that in policing, people move up a pay scale in the over time, and in the broader civil service, of which the NCA is part, they don't.
How much more could they earn in the financial services sector doing cybersecurity? Is it a factor of sort of 2 times, 3 times, 4
at least
times?
that, and then they could earn 20 or 30,000 more in policing, I would have said. But
sounds like a problem.
So that's the first point. The second point is about the overall sort of resourcing levels, and across the public sector, resourcing levels are rising more slowly than pay levels are, and that's just the way we are in sort of society at the moment. And so I think Andrew and I together would have a plan to deal with that, which is about leveraging this whole sort of national set of cybercrime units across forces, across regions, and at the national level, which already is very closely connected, actually, and more closely on the other serious organised crimes that I oversee, but getting that even more closely together. We have a good pilot going on in the southeast, which sort of connects the regional and local level. So how can we scale that elsewhere in the country, and then how can we work even more closely together nationally to regionally?
Okay, Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. To Richard Horn, even under the upcoming cybersecurity and resilience bill, the day-to-day enforcement of cyber resilience is expected to remain distributed to sector-specific regulators. Does that limit accountability and oversight? And I suppose I'm also thinking particularly about national infrastructure and the way that the EU and the US have tackled that, which we seem to be taking a different approach. Just interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, really happy to. So I think clearly our role is to empower the regulators in that scenario, and that's something we do already, and we work with them. I think one thing that's really interesting is if you talk to, say, a water company about why have you not invested in cybersecurity the way I would have liked you to have done, they will tell you that they have, and I can't remember now the regulatory timeframe, but they have their price is set for a window, and that price drives their capital investment, and that drives their spend on things like cybersecurity. So you can't divorce cybersecurity from the overall regulated picture, because cybersecurity is about how you run your business and how you run as an organization. So I think having the regulation baked into the regulators for that sector is a sensible approach, because otherwise you get these two regulators operating essentially in conflict, one demanding something, the other one saying, well, you can't. And I think in financial services, we have seen a step change in cybersecurity of especially the big banks over the last decade, driven by the regulator and the regulatory framework in financial services supported by NCSC and others. So I think we have a model that does work in this country. We need to make it work across many more sectors.
Thank you. And Linklaters found that of 99 cyber incidents reported in 2020 up to 2024, not a single firm was sanctioned by regulators for breaching the then current cyber regulations. Why do you think that is?
I think, is that talking about the cyber regulations being the data protection regulations?
There's the ICA, but and those pretty much were the only ones that were live at the time. I think that's been part of the problem, but that's my view. You're here to tell us your view.
I think that would be my view. And I think Kieran talked earlier about the fact that regulation in cybersecurity has been focused on data, and actually it needs to be focused on services and continuity of services much more, and that's a shift that is beginning to happen.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Maynard.
Yeah, we touched on earlier about the top of the tech stack, and so there's lots of conversation about the small businesses, but talking with the largest kind of big tech businesses, in terms of how has your relationships with those big tech companies evolved, and how engaged are they in UK security and interested to cooperate with you?
Yeah, so I'll happily answer that. So the big tech companies, but we work across the private sector and work very closely with organizations where we can make a scaled impact. And whether it's big tech, whether it's our internet service providers and others, we do have a really good working relationship. And a lot of our advice, a lot of the campaigns we have are often in conjunction with some of the big tech. So, for example, back in November, working with City of London Police, we had a campaign on Stop Think Fraud, and a big part of that campaign was around moving away from static passwords, using two-factor authentication. And we worked with Amazon, put an email out to all of their users as part of that, encouraging them to switch to two-factor authentication. Likewise, other big tech organizations we've been working with on other campaigns. And then in the background, we work very closely with them on some of the more advanced threats that we see that most organizations wouldn't need to know about. But if you're a provider of big technology that the world depends on, then it's going to be focused on you. And we do work in the background with many organizations on that.
Anybody else want to add anything there?
Well, firstly, the UK's cybersecurity is immeasurably strengthened by the arrangements that Richard has described and the close connection with those tech firms. There is a little bit of a but. So I described, particularly on the sort of English-speaking side, the platforms and forums that these criminals use to socialize, and those are, of course, run by some of the same companies. And so, they are active to a degree in trying to, identify breaches of their terms of service, to close down particular groups, and boards and the like. But over time, that is still going on. So the broader sort of Online Safety Act set of questions for these companies needs to be put alongside their really strong contribution to our cybersecurity.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, we kind of think about, we don't suffer from a lack of private sector cooperation or partners that want to come and help. What we suffer from is we can't manage the capacity of people that want to help because we don't have the infrastructure. So we have a lot of very strong partnerships, sort of organisation to organisation, and we might have a joint plan to deal with something. And that's moved beyond, in terms of maturity, that's moved beyond probably the personal relationships these were built on in the past. They're on a firm footing. But there isn't the infrastructure or the sharing of data at scale in an automatic way that would really enable it to kind of turbocharge and go to the next level. One of the interesting things that we're doing at the moment, which I think will help to address that, will be the replacement for the new action fraud system, which will come on, which we're bringing in and will come online towards the end of the year. There are a whole load of kind of financial service companies, tech companies and other partners that want to share their data and be part of that as we build it going forward. Now, that won't come in the first wave over the next year, but those partnerships will build in to allow us to do those takedowns, those stop and block at scale in an automated way, in a way that we've never been able to do in the past. So there's progress, but it takes big investment.
And also kind of, thank you. In terms of the Cyber Resilience Act and what the EU is up to there, what do you think the UK should be doing? Should we be doing something very similar here? And where do you see that transfer of liability is best located?
So I think one thing to notice is that we did actually have an act last year, which has a very catchy title, so I've written it down, the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Act 2024, which did mandate minimum standards that manufacturers of consumer devices, so smart devices, must meet. So the UK had actually already taken a step on that journey before the EU with theirs. So I think it's a continual evolution, but it would be wrong to portray the UK as sort of totally behind on that. I think the CSRB will be Cybersecurity Resilience Bill will be an important step for our critical national infrastructure and our services. And then, as Kieran mentioned, there's a longer term sort of what should the approach be for general producers of software and the liability there. We have a software code of practice. We have a campaign around secure by design. Software code of practice is also reflected in US thinking. So there's work evolving, but it will be a longer journey to get to that kind of place.
Okay. Right, almost out of time, but let me just ask the final question about the recommendations that we need to draw up. I'd be very interested in your priorities for both powers that you don't have or resources that you don't have. So when you think about the work that you're pursuing, what are the kind of powers that you don't have that you wish you had, and what are the resources that you don't have that you wish you had? Richard, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, so powers is a really interesting question, and it gets to the heart of the way the NCSE operates and how we're able to create such a collaborative community, in that we don't have any powers, and that's really important. I've spoken to a telecoms company, the CEO, who said, just to be clear, if I was talking to you as a regulator, I'd have 2 lawyers with me, and it would be a very different conversation, and it wouldn't be collaborative in this way. So I think one of the really the big strengths of the way the NCSE was set up, and something I'm keen to protect, is we're not a regulator, and therefore organisations want to work with us, want to collaborate, and want to get our help, want to share information with us, because they know we're acting, not as a regulator. So I think that's really important. In terms of resources, my view is the way we scale has to be through others. We could, so whether that's working with policy departments on legislation, as with the Cybersecurity Resilience Bill, whether it's working with regulators to reach their regulated sector, whether it's working with private sector organizations who we assure who can provide consultancy, or certified incident response companies. So we have, I think, about 40 certified incident response companies, where if an organization is breached, we can point them to them, they get the support they need, and the information can flow freely back to us and us to them as well. So there's a whole range, and then we have Cyber Essentials, enabling 400 organizations across the country to empower organizations to get Cyber Essentials. So that scaling through others really has to be at the heart of what we do. And that's very much the ethos, that sort of voluntary collaboration and scaling through others.
Okay, James?
On powers, the Computer Misuse Act is a reasonably aged piece of legislation. It's stood the test of time quite well, been amended a few times, but the maximum sentences for some of the offences are not high enough to engage some of the investigatory powers that we would wish to and need to use on this sort of complex crime. Secondly, data is not defined as property under the Theft Act. So I think an offence of handling stolen data or something along those lines is something that is worth consideration. We might offer to come back to you sort of subsequently, Chair, if we have other thoughts to make on the powers side. On incident reporting, though, and some of your members have asked about that earlier, I would just underline the importance of there being a ready expectation of swift reporting to law enforcement, as well as to NCSC and regulators. And I think it may well be right that there are different judgments for companies about when they report to different people. So it may not be as straightforward as, a sort of one-stop shop. But in law enforcement, the sooner we can know that a company has a problem, the sooner we can be going after the sort of evidence that we need to follow up on that, the sooner we can be issuing protect notifications. There are some good stories, there are good stories generally in terms of the companies you've seen today and how they've worked with law enforcement. I mean no criticism of them. And there is some good stories in terms of the protection of the broader sector, both that we NCA specifically and that Richard and his colleagues generally were able to do off the back of some of what they told us. But I would really encourage that it needs to be normalised that both the companies and the third-party companies that come in and support them are just expecting that they are going to be routinely and really quickly sharing with law enforcement, because that can make the investigations so much more possible.
Thank you. Mr. Gould.
I would completely agree with what James has just said. I think the only thing I would add, we do have some quite good powers in this country. What we really struggle with is actually getting the evidence to use those powers. So if I think about the challenges we have around encryption, and you think about digital evidence, much of that is hosted overseas. The length of time it takes to get evidence back from foreign jurisdictions, even friendly cooperative ones, these offences are committed in seconds. It can take years, literally years, to get the evidence and then take that to a prosecutor for a charging decision. So anything that can speed up that process would be really welcome. The other challenge around sort of digital forensics and accessing people's devices once you've got hold of them, and the challenges of beating encryption. Currently, under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, Section 49, there's a power where we can serve a notice to a suspect that says you need to give us your passwords, your recovery seeds to allow us to access this device. It's an ineffectual power, because firstly, you'll only get 2 years for not complying with it, so you'll be out in 1. Well, if you're being investigated for a murder or serious offence, whatever that offence is, that's not going to encourage you to do that. Even for terrorism, it's only 5 years. But there's a further restriction around, we can only serve that notice if we can't physically get into that device. So you're disclosing to criminals what our capability is by the serving or the not serving of the notice. So we don't serve notices. So it's become an unused power. And yet if that would be a great way of beating the encryption challenge. If you've got the same sentence for the predicate offence you've been arrested for non-cooperation with police, then it wouldn't matter what was on their devices, because they'd be put away anyway.
Sorry, could I just clarify one thing? So when I said I had no powers, one thing we do have is we have powers, being part of GCHQ, we have powers under the various intelligence legislation to pursue intelligence and to understand what our adversaries are doing that are really important. So I wouldn't want to leave that.
Anything else, Mr. Gould?
There's probably something around the kind of serious crime prevention type orders, something more specific for cybercrime offenders, maybe to restrict their access to devices and that sort of thing. But that's probably a more minor area.
Yes, so in other kind of very international lines of work, you would have conferences where you'd all get together and talk shop. Do things like that exist? Right, okay, and that does, because in terms of, if you're taking years to get stuff, I mean, that's because in some ways you don't know each other that well.
I'd be careful how I describe this, but effectively there's an element of jurisdiction shopping. So when you come together on an investigation as officers, you will be comparing who's allowed to do what under your domestic legislation. So then you might, so the Dutch might contribute one tactic to an operation, we might contribute another one, and then you bring that together. It's pretty powerful. But again, that takes time. And these are complex investigations, and the international work is expensive. But it's completely the direction we need to be taking this work.
And I would say international collaboration is incredibly strong in cybersecurity. We run a conference each year called Cyber UK, and we have a day before the conference starts, which we call Day Zero. And part of that is this year we had nearly 40 countries represented. It's government officials talking to government officials about how we work together to drive cybersecurity.
And strategic cybercrime cooperation really strong, well beyond the Five Eyes.
Great. Excellent. That's been a brilliant session. Thank you very much indeed for what you're doing, and thank you very much indeed for your evidence to the committee today. That concludes this panel, and that concludes this.
Everyone wants a new, sexy 1000cc motorcycle, a leader bike capable of going over 200